its founder, Prince McMahon.
Everything we do is totally fake? Really?
Prince brought the sport from relatively nothing to relatively something.
Yeah, he made millions taking washed-up athletes and turning them into bad actors.
As American Arnold Schwarzenegger. Oh, and that is our MXC Impact replay. Why don't we take another look at that, Ken? Why don't you tell us about today's safety fluke?
That's foamy bucket slop from the cut man's corner.
Foamy bucket slop.
Looks like he might have just swallowed someone's mouthpiece there, Ken. Up next for TNA.
Check out my overbite.
Here's eco-friendly costume designer Ann Kleinfelter. She makes masks for wrestlers out of their used Speedos.
Yeah, you really have to brown nose her or she won't cut you a mouth hole.
Indeed. Designers are very temperamental people, Ken.
Yeah, I wouldn't want Monty Brown's Speedo mask. Especially after he is a pile driver.
Right you are, and she just pile drives herself right into the fluid. I donated my liver twice. Next up, WWE superstar, the Rock Python.
Yeah, he grabs you.
The Rock Python.
Until your head pops, spits, and then goes limp.
Right you are, Missy Stuff. And there, oh, the Rock Python has pressed himself the victory. And up next for TNA.
Does this helmet make my butt look big? It
That's
does.
former publicist Lenore Poe. Lenore is ushered out of wrestling after misquoting world heavyweight champion the Raven.
What up,
Yeah,
Lucinda?
she'll misquote the Raven. Never
What up,
more.
Edith?
Oh, nice little
Django.
reference, Ken.
Huh?
Oh, look at that. Oh, and there is the fall of the House of Manor. See what I did there, Ken?
No.
Free drink.
See what I did there, Ken? No.
Next up, WWE Women's Champion Trailer Trish Stratus.
Our training table is
Trash Stratus. Alright, we're gonna put that documentary back on. Or not the documentary, but the special about Charles Manson we were watching. Yeah, I need to raise the light up a little bit because I'd still be able to move it back and forth like I need, but it would be, you know. There's the part 2 that we're watching. But let's do 1995 commercials for now while we wait for everyone to tune in.
The Simpsons will be right back.
Pimpsons. Pimporama. Oh, speaking of Pimporama, fucking Futurama. We have new Futurama coming up at some point.
With 9,000 ways to make it a
I don't know when they're gonna release the next season, but a new season of Futurama is on its way. What up, Felicity? Blockbuster.
Is out. Nicholson. Pfeiffer. Wolf. Rated R.
Sweet. Lucinda. Oh my god. Look at the graphics. This is a video game commercial. Look at that. NBA Jam. Alright, let's do an opening of the kiln. The pieces from last night.
Thursday, Gina tells Martin to choose his best man.
Nice. I need to turn this down. Still bright ass ring light, but
Thursday, part of Fox's Wild Adventures at Mardi Gras. Brought to you by 1-800-COLLECT, the way to save on collect calls.
nice,
Did you ever wonder
nice.
what life is like on other planets? Like
Disco.
everybody can slam dunk. And everyone gets a Ford Ranger just for being born. Or
Everyone gets a Ford Ranger. Ford Ranger!
And your biggest decision is what color probe to drive. Maybe there's a world where everybody's job
Next
is
we
just to
have
go to the beach and you get a Mustang convertible
Rabbit
with a company
pendant.
car. Ford. Cool
To
cars
go with
for a cool planet.
the friends down here.
Academy Awards, including Best Actor, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Picture of the Year festivals.
That came out in 95?
Rated R. Now
What What's guy?
Bigger than the Titanic.
Why didn't you tell me this was a cruise for fat women?
You didn't ask me. More fun than the Poseidon Adventure.
We should have left that at home. Should have left us at the altar.
The Bundys go on a luxury cruise.
It's like 25
Got
The sea from hell.
Oh, I'm married to the
Pumpkin Dabber and Dab Stand.
Children tonight.
Boop.
Hello, I'm the critic. On my show, you'll get action.
Can also, I planned for it to be able to go here. Nice. It works.
Romance. Wow, I can't believe I'm on a date with Cher.
The critic. Premiere
And
Sunday,
that goes there.
Simpson.
The Pimpsons.
Kids like Jerry.
And Asarama.
Lives were different. But now they're learning.
Gonna go fast! Gonna go fast!
There's nothing better than being yourself.
Oh, Jada.
Heavyweight, a hit new comedy from the creator of The Mighty Ducks, rated PG, starts Friday, February 17th.
Wait, what is that? Is that gum?
Once again, Jolly Rancher puts maximum taste into minimum space with new Jolly Rancher Tropical Blends candy. Reviewing a massive proportion. You can experiment with all fine exotic combinations. New Jolly Rancher Tropical Blends.
Oh, I remember those.
Fruit squared.
They were chewy. Or they weren't chewy at first. They were still hard as fuck, but in the square form.
Have you had your break today? We all need to get away. There's one place that's on the way.
We're about to put Bach on the, what the fuck? The, Charles Manson documentary we were watching. What the fuck is this? Why is this commercial so long? I still haven't been able to figure out what it's for. They've had fries. Is it McDonald's? It's a McDonald's commercial, okay. I was like, they fucking... Okay, they very subtly... Okay. Couldn't tell what it was, like, the entire beginning of the fucking commercial.
City brings you part of a $20 million buyout.
The entire warehouse inventory from one of the leading juniors and young men's
Yeah.
and specialty store chains.
Fucking style. Oh no.
Savings up to 90%.
Young men's t-shirts and denim shorts, not $10 to $30, only $5.99 and $12.99.
Juniors, denim shorts, rompers, and short alls, not $18 to $30, only $6.99.
What's funny is this style is coming back. Like, you see people wearing this now. But they're paying $100 for each. Oh my god, isn't this a fucking...
Your twin brother.
Well, obviously. The moment I sat down, I thought I was looking into a mirror.
I've actually never seen that.
The twins. That's right.
Roger Ebert says big laughs. Gene Siskel says 2 thumbs up.
Arnold says.
I'll be back.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I've never seen it. I gotta watch it.
Twins.
Late Night Friday on News Channel 5.
Alright, we'll put on the, whatchamacallit. Oh no, Mr. Bat. We need to find a better way to secure maybe 2 magnets. Okay, remember, there's 6 parts to this. We're only on part 2. Wait, no, don't exit home. There it is up here. It's like, why isn't part 2 right there?
Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So this is part 2 of the Manson Family Cults series. And I might have to record this part in 2 different settings. So if you see me in different clothes, different makeup, different hair, that's why. Because I'm up early and everybody's sleeping, but I expect that somebody will wake up before I'm finished doing this. Now, we left off in part 1 where Manson was finally getting out of prison. After the majority of his life being in some kind of penitentiary or boarding school or boys' school or reform school, Charles Manson was finally free. Now, before he left prison, he met a man who would give him
I think we're done with all the orders. I've been sitting here trying to think of what else I need to make, and I think we're done. That's everything for the computer trade. We've done everything for Lexi's so far, because they're getting more stuff, but this first shipment is done. 3 thimbles, 2 sets of cups, a vase, a mug, and the butterfly. Cool. We can make whatever we want tonight. What up, John? Yeah, I think that's everything. The only other thing from this set was this, and we made this last night. And Lexi's getting stuff, more stuff, but the first shipment is done. Cool, yeah. We can make whatever we want. I'm kind of at a loss for what I want to make now. Probably more Swamp Friend stuff. Yeah, I've been cleaning it a little bit more. It's been, actually, it's been cleaner before. There's a lot of stuff in the middle and on this side. But yeah, I've been trying to do better at keeping it nice in order. As well as this. Oh, here, we'll do another pumpkin. We'll keep going with this pumpkin. Already have that prep done, and then we've got this prep here. So we'll start with a pumpkin, and then do something else. Right, Lucinda, I've usually had to try, or I've usually had an end goal for a piece, but now I can start from wherever, and it hasn't been that way in a while, so now I'm just like, what should I do? But there's a bunch of stuff I can do. I've had a bunch of ideas lately. We'll explore.
After he got out of the armed forces, he found himself in LA, and he worked as an extra on movies like Spartacus. He also made some connections in the music industry before he was arrested for drug possession, and he was sentenced to 5 to 20 years. After
trying to think of other Halloween
a couple
stuff.
different prisons, he did also find himself on Terminal Island. And as soon
I'm
as
gonna
he
make some
in Terminal Island,
tubing out of this. I want to do a ghost piece.
he heard Charlie playing his
sort of
guitar,
ghost
and he
something.
liked it.
We'll do a ghost
He
pendant.
thought Charlie was a good singer and
We'll do a ghost
a
pendant.
decent guitar player, nothing special.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
He liked his singing
What up,
voice,
Jay?
and he also liked the way he handled the guards. See, the guards would bully Charlie Manson. They tried to get a reaction out of him. They would make fun of his music and just generally try to taunt him. And Phil heard one of the guards say to Charlie, "You're never getting out of here." And Charlie, who was playing his guitar, stopped playing his guitar, looked up at the guard, said simply, "Get out of where, man?"
Okay.
Before he went right back to strumming and singing to himself quietly. This infuriated
Yeah, J-Dog, we've made multiple.
No matter what they said to him, he always kept his
This one's
cool.
available right now.
He wasn't technically doing anything wrong, so they couldn't get him in trouble for pretending not to know what they were talking about or for being weird. But it pissed them off because they really wanted a reaction. They really wanted him to get upset. They really wanted to see a show, and he wasn't going to give it to them. So Phil thought that Manson was smart and funny. And he thought, you know, he had some musical skill. And he told Manson when he got released to go to his buddy at Universal Studios, Jerry Stromberg, and tell him that Phil had signed. Now, once out on the streets with only his guitar and a feeling of aimlessness, Charlie decided to head north to Berkeley. When he got to Berkeley, he couldn't believe how different things were, how much the world had changed since he'd been on the inside. It was the epicenter for social change and justice. Berkeley, when Manson arrived in 1967, was a heavily politicized school, best known for spearheading the free speech and anti-discrimination movement amongst college-age kids.
Yeah, I've done Meeseeks before.
When students
That's a good choice. or a good option,
and tug of war between the
is we have that blue as well.
and the government would follow. But the students of Berkeley stood their ground. Charlie had no idea what was going on. Besides music, he didn't stay up to date on current events. He didn't know what was going on with the Vietnam War. He didn't know who the Black Panthers were, and he didn't know why he seemed to have been released into a world that was really filled with tension, like a time bomb was waiting to go off. He would soon learn all about this new world, though, and find a way to thrive in the chaos. Which is funny, because as much as Manson enjoyed the climate, the upheaval, the violence of the times, the little guys pushing back against the man, he didn't really share the beliefs of the time. The free speech, the equality. He was racist, he was sexist, he didn't believe in equal rights for everybody. He believed white men were better than anybody else, and he believed he was better than any other white man. The only cause that Charlie Manson would ever fight for was his own. But he fit in with these revolutionaries anyways. For the first time in his life, he was accepted for the very same things that had made him different in McMecken. His prison time was a signal to these college kids that he had pushed back against the man, that the government was trying to keep him down, and that's what the government did. This generation were the ones who were pushing it back against the societal norms of their parents. Counterculture was cool, it was hip. It was better to be weird and an ex-convict than to be normal. And Berkeley was filled with young men and women who were taking their musical talents to the streets, trying to make it big, just like Charlie. He couldn't make money as a musician in Berkeley because there was 100 other kids trying to do the same thing, and there was too much competition for him. Charlie Manson didn't like
J-Dog, we saw you the other day. You were here yesterday, weren't you?
Because this was
or the day before?
Free love generation.
What you talking about?
The Summer of Love, 1967. And sex was being given away for free everywhere you turned, so he definitely couldn't charge for it. And of course, he didn't want to work a regular job. He was a talented musician, and working a 9-to-5 would be a complete waste.
Oh, you know what we'll do? We're going to do a Jack Skellington.
So he pretty much needed to find somebody to live off of while he made his dreams come true. And he found her. Her name was Mary Bruner, and she was an assistant librarian. She was a plain-looking 23-year-old.
Oh, right. I was going to say, I remember seeing your name, though.
Just like so many other kids had traveled west to find excitement in their lives. And she found that excitement when she met Charles Manson. She was shy, and she dressed very conservatively on a college campus of girls who most likely weren't even wearing bras. And she had failed to make a lot of new friends in her time in California. And Charles Manson had been trained by the best of the best in prison. He was adept at picking out girls who seemed lonely, who didn't have anybody. When he met her on the Berkeley campus, she was walking her dog. And he got her attention by stopping and petting her dog and talking to her about the environment, which was a very important and big cause of Mary's. After that, he played her some songs on his guitar and convinced her that he was an earth and animal lover and a musician and pretty much harmless. He also managed to drop in the conversation that he was homeless right now. He didn't have any place to stay. Oh, poor me. Of course, Mary, being the small-town Wisconsin girl who was lonely and needed friends, wanted companionship, she invited him to stay with her for a little while.
What the
until he
fuck?
got back on his feet.
This is somebody she just met?
Into Charlie seducing her and basically living with her permanently while she went to work and paid bills, and he didn't do any of that. He started bringing other girls back to her apartment, which she obviously didn't like at first. She thought that this guy was her boyfriend, and then all of a sudden the other girls started showing up. But he would always be able to make her finally see his way. He made her feel special and pretty when really nobody else ever had in her life. And she eventually just tolerated being one of many, as long as the girls didn't stay around too long, which they never did in the beginning. Joey kind of held out hope that he would tire of this constant parade of girls, and he especially enjoyed the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury, which was hippie central. The summer of 1967 was the summer of love, and children came from all over the country to be a part of the movement which rejected conformity and materialism and been commune-style
Lucky.
communities where everything was shared. There was even a free store and free clinic, and there was a lot of music, drugs, and sex. LSD was the drug of choice. Everyone dressed in clothes they purchased from second-hand shops, flowery dresses and blouses, and military attire. The people here were those who had never felt like they fit in where they'd come from, or they didn't ever feel like they belonged anywhere. So no one judged Charlie Manson. They only accepted him with open arms and peace in their hearts. And for Charlie, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. You had new kids getting off the bus in the hate every day. Kids from all walks of life who were eager to be a part of this new culture. They were innocent, naive, and ripe for the picking. There
I
were
can't wait
just
till that new
as
source
many
comes in.
predators who sought these kids out to take advantage of them. And Charles Manson was one of the worst. These kids were lost, and they'd come to California for guidance on what to do with their lives.
I found the
They were
other
looking
pieces
for
that we're gonna need as
spiritual
well, but I have to
guidance
order
because
them
as much as they
from
wanted to be
Mountain
out
Glass
of the game, they
instead
didn't
of
know how to
Landwork
cheat.
Supply.
And there was no shortage of street preachers in the hate. Manson wandered among these street preachers, just kind of listening to what they were saying, picking up little bits and pieces of their ideologies and their preachings and what they believed in. The purpose of him listening was so he could absorb all of this. Like
Nice guy for sure.
He wanted to copy them because he planned on being a famous rock star. And every famous rock star had...
We won't be on as late tonight as we were last night.
He copied and pasted
Just 'cause we don't have as
little
much
bits
to
and
do.
pieces of their teachings, plus threw some stuff in from Scientology, threw some stuff in from Dale Carnegie, threw some stuff in from the Beatles, and voila! You've got the Charles Manson method. He would stand on street corners or in the park. He would preach to the passerbyers. He would pick up his guitar and play some songs.
Oh,
every so
yes.
often.
I've been waiting for my
What
next
made
pop
him
that way.
stand out amongst so many others were his use of dramatics that he learned from Dale Carnegie. He would talk really low, so you'd have to lean in close to hear him. And then all of a sudden he would yell out loud, so you'd have to fly back. He spoke in a musical, sing-songy way, using large hand gestures, where he happened upon a young red-headed girl crying on a bench. She would go on to become his most devout follower, never wavering in her belief in him until the very end. Lynette Fromm had a childlike appearance and a soft, high-pitched voice to match. She had been born in Santa Monica, California. She was a good singer and dancer, even appearing on the Lawrence Welk show with a dance group called the Westchester Laureates.
Who knows? It's gotta be
Family
just how
moved to
old this
Redondo
torch
Beach.
is,
She
honestly.
began to involve herself in drugs and alcohol, and was even rumored to have had an affair with one of her teachers. With a history of emotional problems
Oh, that sucks,
and a
Sky.
tense and tumultuous relationship with her father, she eventually left home with no plan and no one to look after her. She tells the story of
I need
their
to pull up a
meeting
picture of,
as she was crying on a
Jack
bench,
Skellington.
and Charles Manson approached her, and she thought he was homeless and kind of scruffy at first. But he approached her as she was crying, and he said, "Your parents kicked you out, huh?" And from that point, she thought he was a mind reader and had magical powers. He told her that he was called the gardener because he tended all the flower children in the hate. He sat with her and listened while she unloaded all her fear and anxiety about her life, how she didn't want to be here, she didn't know what she was doing, to which he cryptically responded, "The way out of a room is not through the door. Just don't run out, and then you're free." Which actually makes no sense at all, no matter which way you look at it. But for a young girl like Lynette, he must have seemed...
Nah, it does make sense if you've been in prison. He's talking about the concept of freeing your mind, pretty much. Especially in the concept of people who've been incarcerated, not being locked in that room, you know?
And spiritual. He told her the only reason he was in Venice that day was because something had told him he would be needed there, and he thought that he was compelled to go there because of her. He invited her to return with him to the hate, but Lynette was a little bit on the fence. She was currently enrolled in college, and she wanted to finish out the semester, so he told her, "Well, it's your choice, of course," and he began to walk away. I'm sure he recognized that Lynette Fromm was just the right amount of bent without being broken, that he could walk away and she would follow. And she did. He took her home to Mary, and he began training her. And eventually, the relationship did turn sexual, which most of his relationships
I'm kind of dumb.
It was her first time, and just like Mary, she had never felt pretty or special before. And Charlie made her feel that way. He looked into her eyes and told her that she was beautiful. And he brought Mary in on their intimate times, having Mary watch Charlie and Lynette together, having Lynette watch him and Mary together. The girls were led down this path to believe that the relationship they were a part of was normal and healthy and good.
What
the
the shit?
only reason they might have felt guilty or weird about it was because they had been programmed by society to think that a relationship with a man and woman who were married
I think they wired my
and were
torch
trying
backwards.
to procreate was the
I think they have my torch wired backwards, and I'm just now noticing it for the first time. Wait, what? No shit. How does that work? No way. I don't know if it's backwards or if it's supposed to be like this, but this line I thought was connected to the larger port. Okay, I might have just fixed one of the problems that we've been having. One sec.
The only relationship that was acceptable. He would take the girls on long drives.
Yeah, they're in here at all times, pretty much, or around. They never get near the actual fire,
take their clothes off, run around in the woods and pretend to be wood nymphs while Charlie played his flute for them. The three of them eventually took a place in the Haight, where Mary would have to commute to keep going to her job, but Charlie would be right in the epicenter of what his mission and his calling was.
Okay,
and the three of them lived like this for a little while, but eventually Charlie thought it was time to add another girl to the group because his ego really needed that. And Lynette and Mary were pretty much okay with it. I mean, Mary had by this point resigned herself to this life, and Lynette loved Charlie. She loved him completely. She would have done anything he wanted. She thought he was the smartest person in the world and considered him to be godlike. The next addition to the group, at first temporarily and later on permanently, would be Ruth Ann, the daughter of a former congressional minister who picked Charlie up while he was hitchhiking outside of San Francisco and brought him home to meet his family and his daughter. This man's name was Dean Morehouse, and he had enjoyed talking to Charlie on the drive, so he was like, hey, you want to come back to my house for dinner? I have a really young daughter I'd like you to meet. And Ruth Ann was an adorable, bubbly, tomboy, sort of energetic type that Charlie just really responded to, and she really liked him as well. But Ruth Ann was only 15 years old. Oh. And I mean, you gotta think about this, you know, Manson, he's in his 30s at this point. Ruth is 15. The Morehouses had a piano that Charlie took a liking to, and Dean Morehouse, who was incredibly generous with, you know, bringing this hitchhiker to his house and giving him food and letting him into his life and his home, he says, yeah, you can have the piano, go for it.
You can have it?
He, of course, wasn't going to bring the piano all the way back home. He ended up trading it a couple blocks down the road for a Volkswagen minibus. The bus would give him the opportunity to attract and carry around with him more converts, and he promptly invited Ruth Ann to get on the bus with him and leave, which she did. But her mother was obviously not going to let her underage daughter run away with some old and
I'm still here, don't worry, I'm swapping these tubes around.
By the time they tracked them down in Mendocino a few days later, Manson had already talked Ruth Ann into having sex with him a couple times. He had told her he was a traveling minister and that he was the Son of Man. That's why his name was Manson. Man, son, son of man. She fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. He was arrested and charged with interfering with the questioning of a runaway minor. Not with sexual abuse of a minor,
What the
not with
fuck?
kidnapping. Interfering
Ow,
in the
kneecap.
questioning
Oh.
of a suspected runaway
Okay.
juvenile. That's the actual charge. And Ruth Ann was
Alright, let's
sad to go. Like, Charlie gave her some advice before she left. He said, listen, go home, pick a guy, any guy, doesn't matter, marry him. Because once you're married, your parents have no control legally over you anymore. And then, I will summon you at some point in the future. When I do, you leave your husband and come back to me. Problem solved. And Ruth Ann did just that. She went home and literally the first day
God damn it, y'all.
she married him, moved out of her parents' house. Sometime
Fixed
later,
it.
when Charlie and a much larger group that he'd acquired were hanging out in Topanga for a few days, he would summon Ruth Ann back to him and she would go. The Summer of Love was also the summer of race riots, happening all over the world, but especially California.
Fixed it. It's
When none
annoying,
of that
but
was happening,
I fixed it.
the hippies played Beatles,
Wonder if it's
Sgt.
still
Pepper's
leaking as
Lonely
much as it
Hearts
was
Band
too.
on
I don't think
repeat,
it's even
and
leaking
used the
anymore. I don't
lyrics as
smell
the
it.
soundtrack of their life and the movement.
Oh, it
The
is.
inundation of young people became so problematic, the free resources offered there couldn't keep up with the needs of its population. There were posters put up that said hippies not welcome.
That's okay.
In an effort
I'll need
to
to,
curb the growing flower
Swap
child
that out
population.
anyways.
But it did discourage them, since they were anti-establishment in their beliefs anyways. But these kids were a mess physically. The availability of drugs and sex, a lifestyle of poor diet and hygiene caused a number of ailments in these youngsters. A free clinic was set up that treated hippies with issues such as hepatitis.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hepatitis, right?
Malnutrition,
Sounds like they all
venereal
probably have
diseases,
fucking
skin and bone
hepatitis.
infections, malnutrition, and complications from botched abortions. Birth control was available then, and Margaret Sanger's
So
birth
I
control
mowed my
pills-
neighbor's lawn today, and I ran out of gas mowing their lawn and didn't have enough for my lawn and had to get more. But I also crushed my little, whatchamacallit, boot. In my mind, I'm like, well, damn. I thought doing nice things or doing kind things was supposed to get you good karma, but if this happening and running out of gas is canceling out some other bad karma that I was supposed to get, then by all means. Go ahead and take the fucking crystal cage and some gas. Speaking of, I really do need to swap this out. I'll do this tonight. Actually, that's what I was saying, is that I needed to figure out how we were going to do that, because I don't really want to cut the new tubing, but I might have to. I have to cut the new tubing.
Approved by the FDA in 1960, but it wasn't easily
Yeah, I need a new
accessible
crystal
to
cage.
unmarried
It's all-
women,
it's all
and the cost
bent
was
and broken
too high
now.
for young girls who didn't have health insurance or jobs. But Charlie, Mary, and Lynn, they weren't worried about race riots. They weren't worried about hippies who weren't taking care of themselves. They weren't worried about the real issues that were going on around them. They were revamping their new minibus. They ripped out the seats and put blankets and pillows down so that you could just relax in the bus. They put drapes up. They drove the bus to Manhattan Beach, outside of LA. This is where they would meet Pat Krenwinkel, a girl who would later find herself on trial for murder for Charlie Manson. She was introduced to
All right, there
Manson
you
by
go.
Billy
It's checking
Green, a
the
friend from
pressure and
prison.
everything.
And when Manson met Pat, she was in a low point in her life. Pat was 19. She was plain, had never been considered attractive by anyone in her life, and had recently gone through witnessing her parents' divorce and then moving with her mother to Alabama. She didn't like the racism that was prevalent in the South, and was still emotionally reeling from her parents' divorce, which she claims no one ever wanted to talk about. They always acted like everything was fine and normal, and then one day they just weren't together anymore, and her life was turned upside down. She moved back to California and lived with a drug-addicted older half-sister and her 9-year-old badly behaved son. Manson saw that she was in a state of flux, that she hated her current circumstances and she was ripe for the picking, so he picked her. He sent Mary and Lynn off somewhere for a few days, and he dedicated his full attention to Pat. He made love to her. He told her she was beautiful. She'd never been told that before. He told her she was special. She'd never been told that before. He lavished her with attention and affection, and after 3 days of this, he asked her to leave with him, come on his bus, and go. Pat asked her friend Billy Green, do you think I should go? I don't know this guy. What do you think about him? And Billy Green basically said, why not? You know, this was the times. Why not? This was the yes culture, not the no culture. Get on the bus and go.
Why not?
Try that drug. Have sex with that guy. Do this, do that. Experiment.
Do this, do that. Yeah.
From the norms. Break away from your inhibitions that tell you that going off with a strange guy who basically lives on a bus and has other women following him might not be such a good idea.
Why
That's
not,
the worst that could happen. Much like Mary, who thought that Charles Manson was going to be her boyfriend, Pat was quickly educated as to how life worked as one of Manson's girls. He belonged to no one and everyone. And in a time of free love and pushing against boundaries, who was she to complain about that? The breadcrumbs of attention that Charlie did give each girl was just enough to keep them hanging on because they'd been starved for attention their whole lives, but not too much that they would get used to it, not too much that they would grow accustomed to it or become entitled to it. And they did all seem to get along pretty well. Pat and the other 2 girls, they became friends, and Pat felt like she had gained not only a lover and a spiritual guide, but a group of friends and sisters, which seemed to be an improvement from her previous circumstances.
Also got to be careful with that when you're talking about
because she was
polyamory.
a credit card that her father had given her, and he couldn't get that credit card away from her quick enough. Next, he wanted to go to Washington State, allegedly to find his mother. Charlie and his 3 girls drove the minibus there, and when he got to his mother's door and she saw who was outside, she told Nancy, her adopted daughter, to run and hide somewhere in the house and not come out until Charlie was gone. Charlie wasn't there to reconnect with his mother. Charlie wasn't there to have a relationship with her, to check on her and see how she was doing, which she was actually doing very well. She had become an excellent mother. She'd eventually left Lewis altogether, and she married a really good man who took care of her and Nancy. She was doing great, but he didn't care about that. He just wanted money from her. When she said she wasn't going to give him any money, he left. He was pissed, and he went back to find the girls who he had left at a friend's house, who was a drug dealer and an ex-parole officer of his. And he told them he never ended up finding his mother because he had been rejected by his mother for the first time ever. He had been truly rejected by his mother, and he didn't want to admit that because rejection was something he couldn't handle. Kathleen would never see her son again, which I'm sure she was okay with. By now, I'm sure she figured out that you were only important to Charlie as long as you proved useful to him. She had a child now that she was giving love to. He was giving love to her back. So she knew what a real child-mother relationship and bond could be. And Nancy said when she grew up that she couldn't imagine having a better mother than Kathleen. And she was such a great mom. She was so good to her, and she was basically everything that she could have asked for. They spent some time at this point traveling around in the minibus. They would stay in California, but they did venture out to different states like Arizona, New Mexico. And what would happen on these trips is they would stop someplace, Charlie would start a bonfire, they'd all sit outside and talk, and other nomads and wanderers would be drawn to them by the music, by the fire, by Charlie's dramatic way of speaking, and Charlie would love having an audience. He would gather the other travelers and even the locals around so he could regale them with stories about his life and adventures. But one time, somebody tried to upstage him and told a couple of jokes which made people laugh. This took the attention of Charlie, which outraged him, and he threw his styrofoam cup of wine at this guy. And this is a common theme with these cult leaders. The need for all eyes to be on them at all time. They need to be the most important person in the room. They need to be the smartest person in the room, or at least people need to perceive them as that. He also liked to play a fun knife game with Mary and Lynn while they were on their travels, where he would make them stand against a tree and then throw knives at their head.
That's real fun.
Their heads, always the tree above their
Fun knife
heads,
game.
but it freaked the girls out. He explained it to them as a trust exercise. If I throw a knife at your face and you flinch, you don't trust me. But if I throw a knife at your face and you don't flinch, that must mean you trust me, which is insane.
Yeah, dude, what if you accidentally slip? There's so many factors in that.
A knife thrown at their face without flinching. It's a natural reaction. These aren't trust falls here.
Yeah, it's not a trust fall.
In my head. Why wouldn't I flinch? The girls soon learned that
I like that she said it like that. This isn't a trust
fall. He
fall.
wasn't hitting them or yelling at them or just grumpy in general, which means he wanted everybody else to be grumpy. They had to stay in rapture.
Aha! I fixed the leak for now.
Every time
Temporary
he was
fix.
talking, they had to be watching him. If there was other men around, they could not look at these other men. They could not appear to be interested in these other men. If he thought they were paying too much attention to another man, he would grab them by the hair and slap them or hit them in the face.
What the fuck?
The only time they were allowed to look at another man is when he loaned them out to other men,
What the
which he
fuck?
often did. But when he did that, he was getting something in return, whether it be monetary or something of barter or connections to somebody else who was important. He would use these girls as a currency. He hadn't visited Phil Kaufman's friend, Gary Stromberg, at Universal yet, but he was planning on it. He was working really hard on getting all his songs polished up and ready to play for Gary. He planned on returning to LA soon to be discovered, but when he did, he wanted to make sure he arrived in style, suitable to a rock star of his caliber. He needed an entourage, but the three girls he had with him, they weren't gonna cut it. He mainly tried to use the three girls, Mary, Lynn, and Pat, as a draw for the men, mainly to get other converts to the group. So they would go out and they would talk to other girls, and the girls would want to come back and be with the group because it was other girls who they felt safe with who were bringing them back. And the men would want to come back and be with the group because they were offering them free sex. So he used the girls as a draw, a way to bring more followers. But he didn't think much of their physical appearance. No matter how many times he told them that they were beautiful or special, he didn't actually think they were. And he was trying to get some really choice male converts because women were stupid. They weren't his equals. He couldn't have conversations with them. He wanted some men in the group who were smart, but not as smart as him, who were handsome, but probably not as handsome as him, and who also would do everything he wanted without questioning him. But how was he going to bring in these choice male specimens with the kind of plain bait that he was trying to catch them with? What he needed was an attractive girl who was already promiscuous, so he didn't have to train her, and he could get started within a couple of days just pulling in these choice male converts. Enter 20-year-old Susan Atkins. She had been 15 when her mother died of cancer, and she was turned into the mother figure for her younger brother, while her father tried and failed to keep steady employment. She had behavior problems, depended on drugs and alcohol to make her feel better.
Just quiet in chat tonight.
Wasn't shy to sleep with anyone who showed interest. Another attention-hungry lost soul who left home as soon as she could and moved to San Francisco for a new life. She had been arrested in Oregon in the fall of 1966 when she was caught robbing a gas station in a stolen car. She was given 2 years of probation and worked as a topless dancer in the Haight, where her pleasant looks and overt sexuality attracted the attention of Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. He hired her to be in his new show that included topless female vampire dancers, and she couldn't have been more pleased to be given a job that allowed her to gather admirers and attention. She had to stop working in the show when her health began failing from excessive drug use and a wicked case of gonorrhea. That is when she began a life of an aimless drug addict. She met Charles Manson at the apartment of a friend while he was
In a wicked
entertaining
case of
everyone with his
gonorrhea.
rendition of The Shadow of Your Smile, a popular love ballad at that time that Tony Bennett would eventually cover. Susan was blown away by his skill on the guitar, which was ironic because he wasn't that good. And she couldn't stop herself from staring at him with hearts in her eyes, which his large ego couldn't help but allow him to notice. He was really good at telling what other people wanted, and what they liked, and what they were into without even talking to them. And he could tell she was into music. So he told her, you can pick up my guitar and play it if you want. She then vowed to follow him anywhere. I'm not sure why. She was attracted to him. She thought he was talented. He was enigmatic. She also felt he was godlike. She became his fourth follower and the bait he would use to sexually appeal to men. Next, they all went to Sacramento, where they met up with Pete, another prison buddy of Charlie's. Pete owned a couple of brothels, and Charlie said, "Hey, let my girls work in your brothels for a day. I want to see how they like it." I think it was a way for him at this point to gauge how much control he had over them. What would they say no to? How far would they go? But none of them said no. They worked in this guy's brothels for the day. And then in the future, whenever they were running low on money or maybe they were acting up, Manson told the girls he was going to send them to Pete's brothels. Mary then became pregnant with Charlie's child, and she thought, still naively for some reason, she thought this was exactly what he would need to make him be exclusive to her or value her above all the rest. Manson was thrilled about the pregnancy. He said that babies were spiritually pure, and his child would serve as a model for everybody in his family to strive to be like. Many other girls in the group would get pregnant in the months following, but this was when Charlie was loaning them out to many different men, and he never let them use birth control. He said it wasn't natural, so they could have been Charlie's kids, or they could have been the kids of any other man that these girls had been with. But now they would need a bigger ride, and the VW minibus was replaced with a big yellow school bus that they once again ripped the seats out of and put curtains on the windows, tried to make it more comfortable. They painted it all black. On the side of the bus, the words Hollywood Productions was written. There really wasn't much of a purpose to writing Hollywood Productions on the side of the bus besides to confuse people, and I think that Charlie almost felt like it gave him a feeling of importance when he was driving around in this bus. Like people would see it driving and be like, "Oh, Hollywood Productions, who's that? Is it movie stars and movie crew? What's going on?" They would wonder about who was driving the bus, and he was in the bus and he knew they were wondering about it, so it gave him some sort of ego boost. And whenever they weren't traveling, Charlie was sending them out to recruit people. Women, yes, he loved women, and he saw that they had a purpose that he could use them for, but he needed some male brains on board. Women weren't his equals, especially intellectually. He couldn't talk to these girls. He needed some males on board the bus, the black school bus. A couple of guys that had joined up with the group ended up leaving during an extended road trip because they said the vibes on the bus were just way too creepy and strange. It annoyed Manson, but a few days later, the girls found Bruce Davis. Bruce Davis loved the way Manson had girls around him all the time, and he wanted that too. He wanted to be Manson's second in command and be able to order the girls around and get them to do whatever he wanted. Bruce was a Southern boy from Louisiana, and he'd been the editor of his high school paper. And now his main goal was being the right-hand man of a pseudo-spiritual leader who had the ability to dominate and order around a couple of young women. High aspirations, Bruce. High aspirations. Now this road trip also included, for some reason, a visit to the Morehouse residence, Dean Morehouse, the man who had invited Charlie into his home, and Charlie had left with his 15-year-old daughter, Ruthann. I don't know what Charlie was thinking, but he wanted to show Dean how his gift of the piano had turned into a minibus and now the school bus. He wanted to show him how he had achieved these things from the gift of the piano. And Dean Morehouse was obviously not happy to see him. His daughter had left and married the man that Manson told her to marry, and his wife had left him as well because she blamed him for bringing the person into their home who had eventually led to the loss of their daughter. He told Manson that he wasn't welcome at his home, and he sent them away. But after they left, he sat there and he got more and more upset. Eventually, after a few minutes, he grabbed his shotgun and he went after them to find them, which wasn't hard considering it was the only black school bus with Hollywood Productions on the side in town. When Dean Morehouse put the shotgun to Charlie Manson's head, everybody on the bus was terrified. Charlie had always preached to them that life was the same as death. None of it really mattered. But it was a different story when you were standing there with a gun pressed to your head and an angry father about to pull the trigger. In Manson fashion, something he learned in prison when the guards would try to provoke him, he remained calm, and he simply smiled and said, "Go ahead, shoot me." Dean Morehouse, who was irate off of the rails and literally seeing red, he was taken aback by this. It stopped him in his tracks. Even as Charlie put his hand on Morehouse's shoulder and talked to him about love being better than hate and anger, Morehouse didn't end up shooting him. He put the gun down, he tripped on acid with the group, and wished them well before he left. Charlie's followers were more in awe now than they ever were. He had been held at gunpoint. He was staring down the barrel of a gun, about to have his life come to an end, and he'd never lost his cool. And he had talked a man down who was 1 minute completely outraged and the next completely fine. No human could have done that. He was superhuman. He was like a god. And yes, I agree. Having a gun pointed at your head and telling the person who's holding the gun to shoot you is not normal. I think any person who can do that is probably legitimately crazy. In the fall of 1967, Manson and his family would leave San Francisco for Los Angeles, where Manson hoped to audition for Gary Stromberg and become famous. San Francisco would only get a couple of years reprieve before having another madman in his cult move in 1970, when Jim Jones and his People's Temple settled in the city. Now Los Angeles is known for a lot of things. The Hollywood sign, the Hollywood Walk of Fame, celebrities, getting frozen yogurt and Starbucks on every corner, and they are also known for an incredibly corrupt police force. At this time in LA, the LAPD wasn't much better than it was in the time of the Black Dahlia, or for that matter, than it is today. The LAPD has a history of police issues and misconduct. And even though at this time the population of Los Angeles was racially diverse, its police force was mainly made up of white men who had been to the military, white men who were high school educated, white men who were mainly from the South. It seemed like the city didn't want anyone on that police force that would be sympathetic to the civil rights movement of the time. They were actually taught that black activists like Martin Luther King Jr. were trained and funded by the Communist Party. It was the police force's job to prevent this anarchy from taking over their city. They were given permission to be physical with anyone who gave them problems, and if a police officer was brought up on charges of excessive force, he was defended blindly and tirelessly by the city of Los Angeles. They were not going to let anyone get away with their crime, not in their city, unless the criminal was Hollywood elite, a movie star, a singer, a son of a movie star or singer, writers, producers, sons and daughters of writers and producers. Anybody who was in the entertainment industry, who had money and lived in the right places in town, they were pretty much exempt from getting in trouble for committing crimes, and so were basically their entire families. Police officers were expected to recognize these people and their families by sight so that they would know to let them get away with certain things. And when I say certain things, I mean pretty much everything except murder. And I'm not writing off the possibility that some of these people got away with murder. I'm not writing off that possibility. Teenage Terry Melcher was one of the entitled who was given the good old sweep it under the rug treatment. He was the son of famous actress Doris Day, and he would one day become notable in his own right soon enough. One night, he was driving his car with 3 of his friends. In the passenger seat was Dean Martin Jr., in the back, Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, and Greg Jacobson. And you know, boys will be boys. They pulled over, they took out a handgun. And Dean Martin Jr. and Terry Melcher got out of the car and they started shooting at streetlights. Dennis Wilson and Greg Jacobson, who were still in the car, they came from a blue-collar background. They hadn't really been rich and famous for long enough to understand that there was certain exceptions if you were part of that group. So they were kind of terrified, especially when the police lights came up and police cars pulled up. They thought they were going to get arrested. They were going to get in trouble. But they were surprised when their friends Terry and Dean, standing outside the car, pretty much just laughed and waved as the police cars pulled up. And one of the police officers got out of the car and took away Terry Melcher's gun, but told him, you know, Mr. Melcher, you can come down to the station and grab this anytime. Have a good night. Get home safe. Terry and Dean allegedly left as the cops drove off, and their friends in the car realized that there's a different set of rules. If you had the right skin color, if you had the right parentage, if you had the right amount of money and power and influence. August 11th, 1965 was the evening that black teenager Marquette Fry was being arrested by 2 LAPD cops when a riot broke out, the Watts riot. It lasted 6 days, brought 34 fatalities, 1,000 injuries, 4,000 arrests, and $40,000 in property damage. The riot only ended when the rioters ran out of energy and the Watts area of LA was completely destroyed. This caused paranoia amongst the white population of LA. It was fueled by Police Chief William Parker, who warned them that by 1970, 45% of the LA population would be black, and the next neighborhood that was leveled by a race riot could be theirs. They would need to support a strong police force if they wanted protection from these violent offenders. Blacks all over LA at this time would be scrutinized by local law enforcement and the general public equally. They would always be looking at them like, what are you doing here? What kind of trouble are you up to? Because the police and the politicians in the city at this time were basically trying to scare the crap out of the rich white people so that they would pay the police department and support the police department so that they could be protected from this potential population growth of blacks that would overrun the white population, and you had to be terrified of this. The importance of the racial tensions in LA and the entire country at this time is important because Charles Manson would use this unrest later as a motive for murder. Charlie was excited to get to LA and claim his fame, and he told his group that was following him they needed to be impressive to these record producers and these big important types he would be hanging out with. And they were confused. They were like, why do you care about being famous and rich? He was like, no, I don't care about being famous and rich. My songs are so impactful, so important. The world needs them. That's why I have to impress these people and get my songs out there. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to, like be taken out to dinner and paid millions of dollars so that we can do what's best for the world. And Gary Stromberg at Universal Studios, he met with Manson right away. Bill Kaufman didn't often recommend a lot of people to Stromberg, so he figured the least he could do was meet with the guy and let him audition and listen to his music. Charlie showed up bathed and in clean clothes, but barefoot, with 4 girls in tow. Manson played for Gary in the office, and Gary liked what he heard, so he arranged a studio session. He wanted to see how Manson's sound would translate onto a record. Even though he liked Manson's style and liked his music, he thought it was weird how the entire time that they were all there together in the same room, all 4 girls never took their eyes off of Charles Manson. And the session was a train wreck. He'd never been in a studio before. All the mics and the equipment and people telling him what to do and where to stand and what to do with his voice. He lost it. He had a meltdown. He did not like it. Stromberg carefully and tactfully told him that he should work on his song some more and maybe in the future they could work together again. And this was a polite but casual brush off. He didn't plan on working with him in the future. However, he wondered if Manson could stay in town for a couple of days because he did have a project that the studio was working on. Universal had been throwing around an idea of a movie where Christ returned to modern times, and Gary thought that it would be pretty cool if Manson could hang around and discuss scripture with him and give him his interpretation of the Bible because he thought he had some pretty interesting ideas about the Bible. Gary Stromberg brought Manson and his girls out to lunch a couple of times while they talked, and this was where Charlie illustrated to Gary Stromberg that the Bible says women should be submissive to men, so he would order his girls to get down on their knees and kiss his feet. He then got down on his hands and knees and kissed their feet, because he wanted to show that although women should be submissive, when they behave properly, they should also be rewarded. Stromberg watched as Charlie preached on the beach about the sins of materialism. He was called out by a guy who was walking by. And the guy said, if you don't have a connection to physical things, what do you have that school bus for? And Charlie, not fazed, didn't miss a beat. He tossed him the keys and he said, here, it's yours, take it, I don't need it. And the guy took the keys and got on the bus and drove away, which left them busless. They had no transportation left. If Manson was surprised that the guy took the keys and drove away, he didn't show that. And eventually the bus was returned, which left both the girls and Gary Stromberg pretty impressed at how cool Manson was and collected, and maybe he really did mean the things he said. The modern-day Jesus Project got shut down, and Stromberg wasn't pursuing Charlie getting back into the studio at this point. But Charlie wasn't deterred. He was in LA now, the place where dreams came true, and his eventually would, one way or the other. He and the girls began crashing at the spiral staircase in Topanga Canyon, located in the Santa Monica Mountains. The house was given its name for the spiral staircase located on the outside, which was the only way to access the upper floor, and the staircase would bring you into one of two living rooms. It was nestled in Lower Topanga.
What if it was raining? You had to go outside to get upstairs?
Population of rattlesnakes, but also because of its population of unsavory characters that liked to make their home there. Bobby Beausoleil was also a sometimes temporary resident of the spiral staircase at this time, and every time I see the name Bobby Beausoleil, or I have to say it, I think of Bobby Boucher.
I was just thinking that.
Tell me you don't.
Remember when Bobby Boucher came back at halftime, the Bulldogs won the Bourbon Bowl?
Had a harem of girls around him, but unlike Manson, the girls flocked to Bobby because he was attractive. They were attracted to him. They weren't scared into submission. Charlie figured that Bobby would be a good addition to his family because he could attract the kind of high-caliber, pretty girls that Charlie really wanted around him. And the two had a lot in common, actually, mostly their overblown egos. And Bobby Beausoleil was good-looking, and he bragged about his musical talent, and he was known to have some connections in the music industry. But Bobby wasn't a follower. He thought much too highly of himself for that. He did agree to hang out with Manson for a little bit. They even formed a little band called the Milky Way, which did a couple performances in the Topanga Canyon area.
The Milky Way? I wonder if there's any live recordings of that. That would be a very cool thing to get your hands on.
Interested in staying put for any extended period of time. He did, however, introduce Manson and his girls to Gary Hinman, a music teacher and a drug dealer with a mescaline factory in his basement, who lived nearby. Gary rented a really nice house at 964 Old Topanga Canyon Road, and he generously allowed strangers and new friends to stay with him sometimes and even borrow his cars. But if Manson's time at the spiral staircase taught him anything, it was that he and his girls, they couldn't stay in any one place too long. He hated competition, and places like the spiral staircase were filled with competition. Young men and women coming in all the time, most of them musically talented, most of them preaching an ideology of their own. He couldn't have one of these men who was more attractive, more enlightened, and might offer his girls a better deal, coming in and swooping any one of them away from him. So he packed everybody back into the bus.
Yeah, like Jack Skellington pendant.
To the Mojave Desert, where he preached to them about obedience and minimalism, and played the Beatles music for them in the most isolated place that he could find. By the time they headed back to LA, Susan Atkins was pregnant, most likely from one of the many men that Charlie had pawned her off on while they were on their travels. Charlie was happy about it. Mary was going to be giving birth soon, and once Susan's baby arrived, they would all share the responsibilities of parenting, commune style, like the Hog Farm, a popular commune in LA run by a man who called himself Wavy Gravy. Manson and the girls stayed.
Wait, no shit? That's who Wavy Gravy is? No shit. I know who Wavy Gravy is because of the Grateful Dead and the electric Kool-Aid acid tests and Timothy Leary and further the bus. No shit. I had no idea. Obviously it's not connected, but obviously Charlie was getting inspiration from. I did not know that's who Wavy Gravy was. I always knew they were influential. I always knew that, hi, it's Wavy Gravy, you got some gravy in your eye. That's hilarious. I had no idea.
And that's when they met 14-year-old Diane Lake. Now, Diane was interested in the school bus and their adventures, and Lynn and Pat invited her to come along with them. Diane asked permission from her parents, who apparently didn't think it was a bad idea for her to get on a bus with a bunch of weird hippie strangers and drive off to who knows where, and they gave their permission for her to go. Now, Diane Lake, I believe it was in 2017, she wrote her own sort of memoir autobiography of her time with the Manson family, and it's called A Member of the Family. And I've had a chance to skim through it, but I have not had a chance to read all of it. I wish I had that opportunity because it seems really good.
Appreciate you being here, friend.
Dangled Diane in front of the other girls. He told them that she was what they should aspire to be. She was a pure soul. She hadn't been shaped or ruined by society yet because she was so young. She also became his favorite sexual partner, which is just disgusting. And although he still spread his love out amongst the girls because he had to prove that everybody was equal, she was clearly his favorite for a while. He also spread his wrath among the girls, who would often be seen with bruises and black eyes. Now, in her book, A Member of the Family, Diane Lake said that Charlie had this ability to make sense out of nonsense. I have this memory of being on acid and standing in front of a mirror with him. He was showing me how many different people he could become, just by moving his facial muscles and smiling a certain way, shifting his hair or wearing a different hat. He was a chameleon, and he could find people's weaknesses that way. He preyed on them, and he wanted to teach us how to do it, too. Now, I have my own opinions about many of the followers of Manson. I have my own opinions about who I think was just a confused kid wrapped up in nonsense, who was actually a psychopath and a bad person in their own right, and at the end kind of just blamed Manson. Not that he wasn't to blame. He, of course, was to blame. He should hold a great deal of the blame. But many of his followers were, I believe, bad and evil people in their own rights. Diane Lake was not one of them. She was a 14-year-old girl who had been living in a commune where she'd already been exposed to sexual activity and drug activity. And it's clear how little she was cared about when you consider the fact that her parents allowed
just like, yeah, sure,
14-year-old daughter
go ahead,
to go off with a 30-something-year-old man surrounded by women who he was clearly using and abusing. Diane also, in the hindsight, says she realizes that the warning signs were pretty obvious. You know, that Charlie and his girls were gushing over her. And when somebody's gushing over you and fawning over you too intensely, that's a sign that something's not right. But she said meeting Charlie and his girls was like magic. And that's how these groups will draw in and manipulate emotionally vulnerable young people. When I say young people, I don't mean 18, 19, I mean 13, 14. She was very young. The group wandered around. Like I said, Charlie wasn't interested in settling in one place where there would be outside influences for very long, which is how they eventually ended up at Spawn Ranch. But sometimes they would stay with Jerry Hinman in Topanga Canyon. Sometimes they would stay at the Spiral Staircase. He continued to return to Topanga because he still had hopes that he would be recognized and discovered for his musical abilities. And there was a lot of music types who lived and partied in Topanga Canyon. This was the 1960s, and it was, you know, all free love, everybody's equal. So a lot of these musical types, even well-established musicians, were picking more down-to-earth places to live, more close to the wilderness places. And Topanga Canyon was quite wild at this time, so they would get nice houses there, but they felt like they were living amongst the people. You know, they didn't have gates at their houses, they didn't have alarms or security guards. Even since the 1920s, Candy Canyon had always been a sort of getaway from the city for movie stars and the Hollywood elite who would have cottages there. And in the 1960s, you had artists like Dennis Wilson, who lived in Topanga Canyon, and Neil Young lived in Topanga Canyon. In fact, he recorded most of his Gold Rush album there. Their houses were typically open to strangers who would just show up with their guitar and a song and hope to impress the musician enough to be recommended to his label. Frank Zappa recalled that he would just wake up in the morning and go downstairs to get coffee, and there'd be people sitting in his living room just waiting for him to wake up so they can play their music for him and party with him and hopefully, impress him. So it was a strange time. It definitely, when people say that Manson and his family put an end to the 60s, this is kind of what they're talking about.
Yep.
This freedom, this
you couldn't trust people anymore because of Manson.
And nobody would hurt you, and everybody
Same with hitchhikers.
loved you, even if you were a big
Hitchhiking,
star. Maybe you knew
free
people
love,
would
pretty much,
you, but
and
you didn't think they would mean you anything.
that's a big reason why a lot of people say it's a government conspiracy, because they said, well, the hippies who are against the war, we need this to end, so we need to paint it in a bad light. And a lot of people said, well, that has a lot to do with Charles Manson, the orange sunshine acid that he was getting from the government, and yada yada. I wonder if they'll go into that at all.
And everybody had such a bohemian sort of lifestyle going on where you just lived together and worked together and you tried to help each other, which is great to some extent. And I wish that the world could be more like that. However, there are really bad people who not only want to use you, but do intend to harm. And I do think that a lot of these artists open themselves up to what ended up happening, especially later with Charlie Manson and the Beach Boys.
Yep.
There comes a point when you're famous enough or you have enough money where you need to protect yourself from not the average person, but the crazy person. And
Yep.
Charles Manson proved this. He was aggressive and pushy with these people, and most of them disengaged themselves, and they were like, okay, this is too much. We're all here smoking weed, trying to be chill, and this guy's like going too hard. When potential converts were brought back to Charlie, he would want to test them individually to see if they had what it took to be a permanent member of the group. Even if they didn't have what it took to last in the group, Charlie would basically suck everything they had to give before he was like, this isn't gonna work out. So basically, if they had money, if they had a car, if they had a place to stay, if they had anything that he wanted or needed, he would use them for that until they didn't have it anymore. And then he would say, you know what, you're really not a good fit for our group, so we're gonna ask you to leave. Men were more his intellectual equal than women could ever be. They still weren't equal to him because they weren't, the son of man, but they at least could carry on a conversation. One of these men was Paul Watkins. Paul had a pretty standard middle-class American upbringing. He was part of a Christian family, and they moved around a lot. He spent some time in Lebanon when he was an infant, and after 4 years there, where his father worked on a pipeline, the family moved to Beaumont, Texas, and then to Thousand Oaks, California. When he was a child and a young adolescent, he enjoyed attending church and hiking in the oak grove near his home. He was a Bible student, and he was active in his youth organizations and church camps. But when he entered high school, his musical interests had overtaken his religious interests, and his passion for music and
Hi, Sky.
Paul was one of those kids that he was a really good kid. He was student body president every single year until 11th grade, when he became more involved in LSD and marijuana and music than he was in school. And he was removed from the school when his use of psychedelic drugs kind of interrupted the learning process. He called himself a fugitive flower child in search of enlightenment and truth. And he was hit hard by the Vietnam War when 2 of his friends were sent home from the war in body bags. Paul aspired to be Manson's second in command, but Bruce Davis was already vying for that position. So Manson managed to convince both men that they were both his right-hand man. Manson would send Bruce Davis on scouting missions to basically live with other cults or other groups and see how they function, such as sending him to London to work for the Church of Scientology headquarters from November of 1968 to April of 1969. But Paul Watkins, he kept at his side in order to disarm women that he wanted to join the group, because sometimes these women would be a little put off by Charlie's intensity. Watkins had a baby face and a boyish charm. He had this long, dark, tousled hair and these wide, dark eyes. And when these girls were brought to Charlie, he literally had counseling sessions with them. He would get so deep into their lives and their pasts until he figured out what their Achilles heel was. What was the thing they were most scared of? What was the thing they were most insecure about? What could he use and prey on in order to make sure that they would follow him to the ends of the earth? He convinced these girls that they'd been abused by authority figures all their life, but no one would ever love them more than he would. In fact, Charlie would continue to abuse them one way or the other. One of his temporary followers, who was not broke enough to actually join but was rich enough to use, was Dee Dee Lansbury, daughter of Angela Lansbury from
No shit.
Dee Dee was a beautiful girl. She was still in high school. Every day they would pick her up from high school and she would buy Charlie whatever he wanted, whatever he needed with her credit cards. Eventually, her parents caught on and the money stopped, but Charlie's experience with Dee Dee taught him that the children of the rich and famous were great targets. If not for permanent members, then at least for an income source, because they didn't really want to rebel. They didn't really feel like society
They're rebelling against their parents, not society.
But they wanted to try rebelling. They wanted to try their hand at what was new and fresh and in and all the other young kids were doing. They weren't going to stay. They weren't going to run off with him and let him abuse them and trade them off to other men. But they were going to, give a little quick walk on the wild side and see how they liked it and then go back home to their big house and their money. Like Heaven's Gate, Charlie encouraged his followers to take separate names, new names other than their given name. This way they could separate themselves from their old lives, the societal oppression they'd been under, their birth parents who would never do anything good for them. Susan Atkins was known as Sexy Sadie. Lynette Frome became Squeaky. Patricia Krenwinkel had a bunch, Big Patty, Yellow, Marnie, but she was most often known as Kate. Diane Lake was given the nickname Snake because she was doing a cleanse with the other girls that was like lemon and honey and water, and she claims it gave her a natural high, and she was rolling on her belly in the grass, and the other girls were like, oh, you look like a snake, so they called her Snake, and then Charlie heard it and he liked it, so it stuck. I guess it's better than being called Squeaky, though. Charlie was still called Charlie, though. And if they called him anything else, it was Jesus Christ. Their money was spent to make sure the group had enough LSD and marijuana to keep them sufficiently out of it the majority of the time. And for food, they went dumpster diving, basically. They would go behind restaurants and figure out when they were going to be throwing their old stuff out and just grab it out of the dumpster. The girls were also known to trade sex for some fresher food from the grocery store, and they even masqueraded as Girl Scout leaders and went into markets and asked for donations. When Phil Kaufman was released from Terminal Island in March of 1968, he looked for Charlie and found him in Topanga. Kaufman was surprised and pleased to see that the awkward, scrawny songbird he'd known in prison was now surrounded by a harem of sexually open women who were more than happy to extend their courtesy and generosity to any friend of Charlie's. After being locked away in prison for so long, he eagerly took anything they had to give, including STDs, I'm sure. Manson told him that a big problem with society was the fast rate that the blacks were reproducing. And in order to counteract this threat, they needed white guys like him and Phil to get as many girls as possible pregnant so that they could keep the scales balanced. I don't know if he thought that him and like 5 or 6 girls were gonna populate the world, but Charlie also let him know that his meeting with Stromberg hadn't really gone as planned. He wanted to know if Kaufman had any other connections or musical friends that he could, send his way. Kaufman, who's now out of prison, he wanted to get back into the entertainment industry. He would keep living with Charlie while he got on his feet and got his, head back in the game. And then when he found somebody or he had an in, he would make sure that he brought Charlie along with him. The group's days were pretty much all the same. They woke up late because they'd been up all night doing drugs and having orgies. And the girls would get something ready for breakfast while the men repaired things, most usually cars, vehicles, or bikes that Charlie had found or been given that needed to be fixed. The weird thing was, as soon as these cars or bikes were in mint working condition after they'd all worked on them tirelessly, Charlie would sell it or just give it away, and they would get upset because they put their hard work, their blood, sweat, and tears into fixing these vehicles, and then Charlie would just give them away. And Charlie was like, no, this is a lesson for you guys in materialism and being too connected to physical things and doing this for your own good. Really, I think that he just wanted profits
doing
to
Halloween
keep
stuff
everybody
tonight
busy during the day, so they wouldn't get too bored, idle hands. They wouldn't start thinking too much about what are we doing here and is this what life is? He didn't allow them to have watches or calendars. He didn't want them to ever know what day it was, what time it was. He said time was a fake thing made up by society. Somebody just one day said, this is what time it is, and everybody went along with it. So it didn't really matter. It wasn't important. It wasn't relevant. Really, I think he just wanted to keep them disoriented and distracted. And wherever they were living, Charlie made sure there was a time and place for sex and drugs.
Making pumpkins.
There would always be a room set aside for the group sex, and Charlie would be there giving out commands of who should be with who and how they should be with that person, just basically directing it like some weird porno director. Since the women always outnumbered the men, though, these sessions would consist of the women taking care of the men and not getting much back in return, if you know what I mean. They didn't dare complain about this ever, though, because according to Manson, it was the woman's job and top priority to make sure the men were taken care of and happy, and anything else that they got after that would just be gravy. Wavy gravy. And Charlie would always be the doses of LSD to his followers, always making sure to take a smaller dose himself. His followers would marvel at the way that he always seemed to be in control, even when everybody else was tripping out of their minds. And he did that purposely, wanted people to think that he couldn't be touched by things like drugs and alcohol or illness. He was above that. Dinners were cooked by women, of course, family style, and afterwards they would have some entertainment, which was Charlie, usually, always, singing his songs or Beatles songs, and sometimes the girls would pop it in and sing backup. And then after that, they'd probably go out for the night, see if there was a party around, just wander around, see where everybody was at, what was happening, where was the scene. Kaufman knew some people around town, and he would sometimes take Charlie and his girls with him when he popped in for visits. One old friend was Harold True, who rented a house in Los Feliz on Waverly Drive. Manson saw that the area where Harold rented was pretty nice, not millionaire status, but they seemed wealthy and well off. Harold ended up moving out of the neighborhood a couple of months later, but sometime after that, another couple moved onto Waverly Drive, next door to the house where Harold had rented. Their names were Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. After about 5 weeks, Phil Kaufman left the group. He hadn't been useful to Charlie as far as
LaBianca murder.
And he had begun to question Charlie. And Charlie could not have anyone questioning him, especially in front of his group. He could not have that. So he and Phil split ways, and it wasn't a bad parting. They weren't mad at each other. They still kept in touch. Phil wasn't the kind of person who's going to be manipulated or fall for Charlie's tricks, and Charlie knew that. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and a wave of race riots broke out across the nation. While all of this was going on in the world, Manson was telling his followers that they were lucky to be avoiding it all, keeping to themselves and living in a drug-induced haze. Just like Jim Jones, when he would preach to his followers of how bad it was in the world, how there were people out there who would hurt them, and that they were lucky to be safe with him. The less they knew about what was actually going on out there, the better. They just needed to know he was bad, but he wouldn't let that touch them. That same month, he met Sandy Good. Sandy was a young girl who had experienced health issues in childhood, even having to have one of her lungs partially removed, leaving her throat and her torso scarred. Because of their guilt over her health problems and their divorce when she was 4, Sandy's parents spoiled her. In the spring of '68, she was on a quest to find herself. She visited LA to see a friend there, That's when she met Charles Manson. The relationship between Sandy and Charles Manson was perfect and symbiotic for him. He offered her a family who would always love her, and she offered him a trust fund. She was getting $200 a month from her stockbroker father that she happily signed over to Charlie. Sandy is an interesting person, and in the last part, we're going to do a little bit more talking about where they are today, but she was pretty much a die-hard follower of Manson's until the very, very end. And she was a little different than the other girls at that point, too. She wore makeup and jewelry, she took care of herself a little bit more. She came from like a sort of upper-class family who had money, and she was even described as being snobby by people who knew her. Charlie spent a lot more time working with her to brainwash her, to completely desecrate the person she'd been before to the person he wanted her to be now. And I think that might have something to do with how she turned out and how she became this person that even in her 50s and 60s was defending him. The reason he focused so much time on her, though, was because the girls didn't really like her when she came in. She was kind of stuck up. And he wanted her to stay because he wanted that money that she was getting every month from her father. So he told the girls, like, you have to be nice to her. And he made Sandy take her clothes off in front of them and showed them the scars on her and said, look what her birth parents have done to her. Nobody's loved her. Nobody's taken care of her. It's our job to take care of her. Look at what she's been through in her life. Of course she's got some other things to overcome and maybe things that make her different than you, but we need to still accept her and love her. Not because he wanted her to be accepted and loved, but because he wanted her money. Another person that Charles met in April was his son, Valentine Michael Manson, named after his favorite character from his favorite book, Stranger in Strange Land. The baby was born on April 15th, and although Mary wanted to go to a hospital and be treated by actual, medical professionals, Manson insisted that that was not how they did things. This was going to be done the natural way, at home, with the help of the other girls to deliver the baby. Even though the other girls told them, we don't have any idea how to deliver a baby, we don't know what we're doing. He said, you're women, it's innate in you, you'll figure it out. The baby was breached
You'll figure it out.
A lot of pain and suffering on Mary's part. Somehow the girls managed to fumble their way through this delivery, and miraculously both the mother and baby were born healthy, and he was given the nickname of Pooh Bear, which is Pooh for short. Although Pooh Bear and the other children who would eventually be born into the family and live with the family were well taken care of. Charlie himself had very limited patience for children. He would talk in reverence about the pure soul of a child, about how they would save us all. They are who we should strive to be like, this untainted being. But if they cried too much or too long, it would drive him absolutely nuts and he would be furious. So it became the general practice to keep all children away from Charlie at all times. They were usually isolated to a separate room as far away from where Charlie was as possible and put into the care of whoever Charlie decided would be.
I think it's just warm again outside because it's still 74 in the house.
Their parents around them. He thought that it was an unhealthy connection and relationship to somebody, and it would distract.
The only thing for Dragon Balls is the stars would have to be on the outside,
They have a child.
Unless we did a down stem on the inside of it that had stars on it. Had a star on the down stem. A single star Dragon Ball down stem.
With Manson, they may realize what actual love is, and it wasn't what they felt for Charlie. What they now felt for their child. So he made a huge effort to keep the birth mothers away from their babies, which I think is just awful. He would assign them to different parents, and this is also what Jim Jones did when his followers arrived in Guyana. If they were with their families or if they were with a spouse, he would separate them and make sure that they didn't have any connection so that they felt isolated and they felt like the most important person in the world was Jim Jones. Manson kept sending the girls out, but this time he wasn't interested in them going out to get new followers. He was interested in them going out and finding important people in the record industry, in the music industry, in the film industry, anybody who had connections to somebody else that might help Charlie achieve his goal of being famous. It was like the original LinkedIn. He thought if he had another musician who had already made it, hear his music and vouch for him, that would be just the stepping stone he'd need to make it in his own career. And in a fateful turn of events, that's exactly what happened. Patricia Krenwinkel and another member, Ella Jo Beasley,
Patricia
were
Krenwinkel.
hitchhiking on the strip when they were picked up by Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys. At this same time, the band, the Beach Boys, were going through their own crisis. They had been popular once, but ticket sales were down, and their new songs didn't have the same sellability as they once did. They had released 19 albums in 7 years. Each one proved to be less in demand than the one before. During one tour, ticket sales were so low that they had canceled it halfway through, taking a loss of $500,000.
Damn.
Dennis had gone back to LA to waste his time with girls and drugs. Dennis Wilson had always been kind of a rule breaker and a rebel, and he was appreciated by his bandmates for the energy he brought to their live shows, but they didn't take him seriously with much anything else. He was immature, and although he was very talented at writing the musical element of a song, he wasn't very good with lyrics. He was renting a house on the west end of Sunset Boulevard on 3 acres, a rugged log cabin exterior with a luxurious mansion interior.
Damn.
It was the place to be for his old friends and new. He was a giving and generous person who loved meeting and talking with new people and enjoyed sharing the success he had in life with other people. He and his brothers Brian and Carl, also in the Beach Boys, came from a working class background, and they were born to a father that was physically abusive and used them when they got famous until they finally had enough. When he picked up Pat and Ella Jo on the road, he asked them did they want to come back to his house for some milk and cookies, and this sounds like code, but it wasn't. He actually really did give them milk and cookies. And then he asked them about their life, and they talked together. He was interested in new people. He was interested in these young bohemians who were taking over the entire city. It wasn't strange for him to pick up hitchhikers or travelers or strays and bring them back to his house and entertain them, give them food, give them drugs, talk to them, become friends. The girls told him about Charles Manson, their leader, their messiah, and the life they led and the freedom they had. When they got back to Charlie, they told them about their encounter with Dennis Wilson. And he was like, that's Dennis Wilson. It's like the drummer of the Beach Boys. And they were like, oh, yeah. And he was like, you need to bring me back there immediately. So he made the girls bring him and the entire family back to Dennis Wilson's house. But Dennis Wilson wasn't there. He had to leave to go to the recording studio. And he pulled his Ferrari into his driveway. He saw that the lights in his house inside were on. And as Charles Manson walked out of his house, as if he was inviting him in to his own home. And when Dennis got out of the car, he thought that Charlie was going to hurt him or rob him. And he said, are you going to hurt me? And Charlie Manson said, do I look like I'm going to hurt you? And then he got down on his knees and kissed Dennis Wilson's feet. Charlie then walked Dennis into his own home, where everyone was waiting inside, making themselves comfortable and at home. Dennis recognized the two hitchhikers, Pat and Ella Jo, that he picked up earlier. He was a little annoyed at first. He was like, what are you doing? Bringing all these people back to my house. But he eventually got over it when he saw that everybody was basically having a party. There was music and most of the girls were topless. He was probably like, hey, I might get robbed tonight. These people might tie me up and take everything out of my house. But they seem to be having fun right now. So you can't beat them. Join them. The next day they were still there. And the next day.
Not
the
yet.
next day. Dennis
I don't know if you.
He liked Charlie. He liked listening to him talk.
Are you on? You're in the Discord.
Elevated, very smart.
Yeah, whatchamacallit.
To Charlie talk
Said
about
the final approval may take a while.
I don't
a long
know
while,
if he knew about
unfortunately.
Dennis Wilson's
But we're in the
past
final
as
stage of
a
approval.
father, or if he just used his intuition to kind of figure out that was a soft spot for Dennis. But that was exactly what Dennis wanted to hear. That was what spoke to him the most. Through Dennis Wilson, Charlie met other people in the music industry.
I definitely need to swap that
Now, Greg Jacobson, if you remember the story from earlier about Terry Melcher and Dean Martin Jr. and how they were shooting the streetlights and the cops came and confiscated their gun, he was in the back seat with Dennis Wilson when that happened. But since then, he had become a talent scout for his friend Terry Melcher. When he met the family at Wilson's house,
step 3, get reviewed in progress.
Because Manson had been given the head up by Dennis Wilson that this was the man you wanted to know and get in with. You wanted to make it in the music industry because he's got Terry Melcher's ear, he's a talent scout, you need to get to know him. Manson knew that Greg was married, so he couldn't just throw any old girl his way. It had to be somebody special who would catch his attention, who would convince him to stray from his marriage. So he handpicked Ruth Ann Morehouse to give to Greg as a sort of present, and the two began an affair of some kind. Whenever Greg was around, they would hook up. Now, usually Charlie Manson would be at first having one of his girls form a relationship with another man, one that lasted more than one time at least. But her presence kept Greg coming around, and Manson really wanted Greg to keep coming around because he really, really wanted to be a famous rock star. And he knew that somebody like Greg would be able to help him do that. Now, Greg was not super impressed by what he heard when Manson played, but Dennis Wilson kept insisting, like, Charlie's the next big thing. He's going to be great. So
Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to think of what we're going to put on the top of this, actually.
It was started by the Beach Boys manager, Nick Grillo.
I'm thinking a cat or a bat.
Shareholders, and they had left Capitol Records to start
or a
their
candle.
own label so that they could have a little bit more freedom over their music, and also so that they could
think a candle would be
bring in
fun.
new talent to manage. So they were pretty much allowed to bring in whoever they wanted and record whoever they wanted. That was up to them. But since the tour fiasco, where they lost 500,000 people, they did not want Charlie involved with their label at all. They didn't think he was that talented. He gave them a bad vibe, and they actually hired a private investigator.
So the stem, that green piece is already the mouthpiece.
They went to Dennis with this information.
But I do like the skull idea, a skull.
And Dennis was surprised.
With a candle on top of the skull.
Charlie had been telling the truth about being a jailbird, and being somebody who was a hardened criminal. Usually people lied about that to get clout or to get a reputation, but he was actually happy and pleased when he found out that Charlie had been telling the truth. So I'm going to end part 2 here. In part 3, we're going to pick up with the rest of the story. How Charlie eventually realizes
we're going to do the next part, and then we'll probably be done for the evening.
How he turns violent, and how he directs a group of people to go on a murdering spree. Hope you guys enjoyed part 2. I'm going to get started working on editing this so that I can get it up for you by tomorrow, and then I will get part 3 out before I leave. Love you guys so much. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Bye.
Part 3.
People remember heartwarming ads. So to help you remember that Liberty Mutual customizes your home insurance, here's a touching moment. Liberty Mutual, it's perfect.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. This is part 3 of the Manson family series. Now I know it took some time because I went on vacation and a lot of things happened to prevent this from getting out before now, but here it is.
Liberty
There will be part 4 to follow, and there will also be a bonus part after.
I didn't say it that time.
I have a little surprise and a thank you for being so patient and bearing with me through my trials and tribulations. So I'd really like to chat with you about how my vacation went, all the cool things that happened, the funny things that happened. It was definitely an experience, but I am making a vlog, an April vlog for you guys. So it'll be basically everything that happened in the month of April, and I'm compiling all of that into one vlog. And I will probably be doing that every month, just putting out one vlog a month that kind of just puts the entire month into one video. So keep an eye out for that, and we will chat a little bit more in that video. But right now, I want to dive right in, and I want to get started because we have so much to cover, and I also have an exciting new sponsor to talk to you guys about. I am so excited to be working with this company. I think it fits into what we do and what we talk about here so well, and not only that, but it is actually something that I personally use, I personally believe in, and I personally love and have so much fun with. I know I have told you guys in the past that I will never accept a sponsorship or promote any brand that I don't personally believe in 100% myself. And Hunt to Kill started on the first season, and we had so much fun. We have this board that we kind of keep everything together on, try to pull out the clues. In this specific box, it was so fun because it's the murder of a guy at his high school. Put the Hunt to Killer pin on. That way all other Hunt to Kill keys are consistent. Oh, so are the eyes. So are the T's. Those big old T's. on the movie set. The owner, George Spahn, was 80 years old and going blind. He let Manson and his followers live there for free in exchange for labor, like daily chores and helping run the forest rental business he operated on the property. It was also rumored that the girls worked in Spawn's personal space, like his own home, especially Lynette Squeaky Fromm. One of the duties she was tasked with was to keep the old pervert sufficiently happy at all times, if you know what I mean. This is actually where Lynette Squeaky got her nickname, because George would often pinch her butt and her thighs, and she would give off these little squeaks. So George called her Squeaky, which the rest of the family thought was funny, and it stuck. But the family was staying for the majority of the time at Dennis Wilson's. They had a pool, they had running water, they had electricity. Dennis was generous. He made sure they always had enough food and alcohol and drugs, and in return, Charlie would make sure that Dennis and his friends were well taken care of by his girls. They never said no, although I don't think they were given much of a choice. Even though Dennis Wilson always had Manson's back, and he defended him, and he tried to get him signed, Charlie eventually became frustrated with Dennis's lack of ability to do so. And he realized that dealing with the artists themselves wasn't as effective as dealing with the businessmen who actually made the decisions. Terry Melcher and his girlfriend Candace Bergen rented a residence at the top of Cielo Drive in the Benedict Canyon area, which boasted a fantastic view of Los Angeles, laid out in all its twinkling majesty at their feet. Melcher had played in some bands as a teenager, but mostly lived off of his mother, Doris Day's name and fame, until he caught a break at the age of 22 when he was made a producer at Columbia Records, a company that his mother owned quite a bit of stock in. He was the youngest producer on the label, and he proved that he had more to offer than his mother's name, producing more than 80 chart hits for Columbia. Manson pretty much thought that he would be signed by Terry Melcher immediately, since Terry Melcher was now in the position to sign whoever he wanted. He had proved that he knew what it took, and he could pick out a really talented artist or band. And he was tight with Dennis Wilson and Greg Jacobson. They had been friends since they were young. But Terry Melcher was a businessman first and foremost, and he hadn't grown up blue collar like Jacobson and Dennis Wilson had. He had grown up with a famous mother, and he didn't trust strangers, and he didn't bring home strays. There was no way he was going to ruin his spotless track record by signing somebody he didn't 100% believe in, even if his friends had his back and vouched for him. He didn't think that Manson had something special,
but I popped earlier and I keep scratching it accidentally because I don't get zits often. I keep forgetting it's there.
Maybe he would appeal to smaller audiences or niche groups, but he didn't have that nationwide Beatles kind of draw that would bring in the money that Terry was known for bringing in. Terry Melcher always kept Charlie Manson at an arm's length. He was polite and he was courteous.
I'm going to end up needing to swap this propane line out.
Invite to his home. Terry Melcher had brought into his adulthood the kind of privacy that he saw as the child of a star, and as a child star himself. He kept everybody kind of away from the private areas of his home, even his own guests, even his own friends. He wanted everything to be separate, his personal life and his public life. But Charlie was really annoyed by this because Melcher did throw these epic parties at his Cielo Drive home. All the biggest names in the industry would be there, and these were the kinds of people that Manson really wanted to get in front of. And just being invited to one of these parties at Terry Melcher's home would...
Tiny leaks there too, but the bigger one is down here.
Kill 99.9% of bacteria and viruses with OxyClean Laundry and Home Sanitizer.
Would have given him access to so many of these people. It really pissed him off that Terry didn't feel comfortable enough with him, like Dennis Wilson did, to invite him into his home. And the only reason that he even knew where Terry Melcher lived was because Dennis Wilson drove Terry home one day and Manson came along. It was pretty clear to Charlie and everyone else that Terry Melcher didn't care to know Charlie Manson in any other capacity than a casual acquaintance. Melcher did, however, take quite a liking to Ruth Ann Morehouse, who was also greatly liked by Driver Jacobson. And he had no problem bringing Ruth Ann to his home. He even suggested that he would move Ruth Ann into his house as a housekeeper, which his girlfriend, Candy Bergen, quickly put a stop to. She may have known what her boyfriend was doing on the side, but she definitely wasn't going to have it moved right into her house and live under her nose.
I'm going to use
Once
this
he
to do
was
it.
shunned by Melcher, Charlie just kept trying to get closer to Dennis Wilson. They shared this secret racism. They both were kind of racist, and they both had an interest in keeping that under wraps. But together they felt that they could talk about it.
That way I only have to
Dennis,
cut the old tube that we're replacing. I'm going to cut this here, use this here, so I can attach the new tubes that have A-fittings directly to this without having to cut the new tube.
and Manson had their own safe space when it came to discussing racism. Obviously, Wilson wanted
I'll do
to
that later,
keep
of course.
his distaste for blacks under
That's
wraps because
my
it was
goal
a
for
public
tonight.
figure.
The next.
And Charlie didn't want his family to know that he was racist because he preached to everybody that all people were equal. Everybody was the same. So he couldn't have them knowing his actual views because it went against everything that he taught them. He also tried to isolate Dennis Wilson from his brothers and his bandmates, saying out loud what
that's what I'll do
Wilson
after
already
stream
kind
tonight.
of suspected inside his
Is
own
my
head,
phone?
that they thought he was a joke and they wouldn't let him write songs
My phone is not
because
plugged in.
they
I might
didn't
as
take
well
him
plug it in
seriously.
now
And Charlie
before it
hated
even
how everyone called him
gives me the
and his
notification.
followers hippies. He said they weren't hippies, they were slippies. Hippies were pacifists, and there's great violence and upheaval coming that these softies would not survive. He said they were slippies because they were able to slip through the cracks of society. Soon enough, the group would attract more male followers, which was important to Charlie, remember, because he did not value women as intelligent beings. He needed men around to talk about manly things with, kind of like that little small town where he was brought up by his aunt and uncle in, where they had really strict gender roles. I think he was more influenced by that than he thought. Charles Watson, or Tex, came to find the family through Dennis Wilson. Dennis met Tex one day when he was out hitchhiking, and I mean Dennis Wilson was hitchhiking, and Tex Watson picked him up. Even though Dennis Wilson had more than one car, more than enough money, it was still kind of cool in those days, in those times, to hitchhike, and it brought you closer to the people. Even though Dennis Wilson was rich and famous, he wanted people to think that he was like everybody else. He wanted himself to think that he was like everybody else, because that was the times. Everybody's equal. I'm not better than you just because I got lucky and got a record deal. So it was something that he did, even though he owned a Mercedes, to hitchhike every so often. So Tex Watson is a controversial figure. And we will discuss that more later. But pretty much he is sometimes painted as this small town Texas kid, honor student, athletes, and Charlie Manson completely corrupted him. But Tex Watson was on his way to being corrupted far before he fell in with the Manson family. Tex was from Cokeville, Texas, and during high school he was an athlete and an honor student. He grew up Methodist in a family that told him that in order to reach his goals he had to work hard, get an education, and lead a moral life. After graduating from high school, Watson chose to go to North Texas State University in Denton. Now, Denton was very different from the small town that he grew up in, Cokeville. And a lot of people believe that this is where Tex Watson started to kind of go off the path. This is where he became involved with the party scene and drugs. Now, to make some money, Tex ended up taking a job as a baggage handler for an airline company, and part of his payment, I guess, included free airline tickets, which is awesome, by the way. And he used these airline tickets to travel all over the country. One of these places he went to was California to visit a friend, and when he got to California, he fell in love, and he never wanted to leave, so he didn't. Now, Tex did try to keep going to school and get that education and lead that moral life that his family had taught him to do, but he ended up dropping out. I mean, like we talked about before, this was the 1960s in California. Everybody was in the free love, hippie, psychedelic drug thing. Everybody was just trying to do as many drugs and have as much sex as possible. So I imagine he was very
So this is the first time I've ever done a candle,
so he ended up dropping out so he
I'm
could
very
enjoy
confident
life.
in it.
And that is when he found Dennis Wilson waiting on the side of the road to be picked up and entwining their fates together forever. Now, according to Tex Watson, he was just driving down Sunset, and hikers were pretty common on Sunset Boulevard. Pulled over to pick this guy up. The guy got in and was like, "Hey, my name's Dennis Wilson." And Tex was like, "Okay, hey, Dennis Wilson." And then Wilson was like, "I'm one of the Beach Boys," like he had to let him know because Tex didn't know who he was. And then obviously Tex Watson was very impressed. You lucked out when you pick up a rich and famous recording artist as a hitchhiker instead of a murderer. Now, obviously, Dennis Wilson has Tex drop him off at home to his mansion, and when Tex Watson pulls up to Dennis Wilson's house, he's like, "Whoa, this place is legit. Like, it's huge. There's cars parked outside, there's parties going on, there's girls all over the place. Like, this is awesome." Tex Watson was dropping Dennis off, and he thought, he's just gonna drop this guy off and then go on his way. But Dennis Wilson invites Tex Watson into his house because that's what he did. That's what he did. He just picked up or had other people pick him up, and then he's like, "Hey, come in." And like I've said before, this is a great ideology that everybody gets along, everybody's friends. You can pick somebody up on the side of the road and invite them in for dinner and then make a lifelong friend, and that's great. However, we don't live in a world where that really always works out too well. And in this case, you bring together Tex Watson, who I believe has his own issues aside from Charlie Manson, and Manson, who we all know is a psychopath. Now, when he goes into the house, who does he meet but former Methodist minister Dean Morehouse, Ruth Ann Morehouse's father. How did this happen? How did Dean Morehouse end up living at Dennis Wilson's house with Dennis Wilson, Charles Manson, and the family of girls, including
about 40
his
minutes
daughter?
left in this,
Wow.
and then so we'll go to 1 o'clock tonight.
Dean Morehouse had a rocky life. There had been some incidences with him and the law, and possibly after his interaction with Charlie and the family and his acid trip, losing his daughter, losing his wife, he decided that maybe these hippies or slippies had the right idea, and that you should live life in a more free manner and push away the bounds of society. So he found Manson and the family and basically asked to join. But Manson, who also thought it was weird, so it's weird. When Charles Manson thinks something is strange, it actually is. He wanted to join, but Manson thought it was weird, so he kind of was like, "I'm not gonna make you a full member of the family, but you can hang around." And Dennis Wilson actually took a liking to Dean Morehouse and let him stay on as a kind of caretaker, let him live in his house and do some odd jobs and landscaping and stuff like that. But it's very strange because now this man, this older man in his 50s, is living in a house where his young underage daughter is doing a lot of drugs and having sex with a lot of different men. It's just a very awkward situation. And Dean Morehouse had his own perverted tendencies. He was actually kind of alienated by the women who were getting sick of him constantly roping them and making advances. And eventually Charlie and the women kind of shunned him. But at this point, when Tex Watson arrived, Dean Morehouse was still in their good graces. So he was talking to Tex in the kitchen. He was like, "Listen, there's somebody here you've got to meet. This guy, Charles Manson. He's amazing." So Tex Watson goes into the living room, and Charlie's sitting on the floor playing guitar, surrounded by women. And then they all got high. And according to Watson, this wasn't what drew him into the family. It was the sense of community, not the availability of girls and drugs and the mansion that they all lived in, but the sense of community. He says, here I was accepted in a world I'd never dreamed about, mellow and at my ease. Charlie murmured in the background something about love, finding love, letting yourself love. I suddenly realized that this was what I was looking for. Not that my parents and brother and sister hadn't loved me, but somehow, now that didn't count. I wanted the kind of love they talked about in the songs. The kind of love that didn't ask you to be anything, didn't judge what you were, didn't set up any rules or regulations. Yes, Tex, the kind of love given to you by your family, the mother who birthed you, the parents who raised you, that's not real love. This dude sitting on the floor playing guitar and giving you as much LSD as you want. That is love. That's the kind of love songs are written about. So at this point, Dennis Wilson pretty much knew that Brothers Records was never going to sign Manson, but he still wanted to accommodate Manson and his family as much as he could, even paying for their medical and dental bills, which you can assume were numerous. And he was happy letting things go on as they were, but Manson was not. Things were getting stagnant, nothing was moving forward, and his family, his followers, were becoming too comfortable with Dennis's hospitality. They were enjoying life. They were lounging by the pool. They were living in a mansion where superstars and actresses and actors and singers came over every day. But he didn't want them, did he? He didn't want them to enjoy life and have a good time. When he took them in, they were depressed wrecks. They had no direction. They didn't know what was next. Now they were having a good time. Because of their initial despair, they turned to him. But happy followers, these happy followers, they may realize that they didn't need him to be happy, to feel something, to have a purpose. That happy...
I think this is going to be a really cool candle because of the fire that I just made for it.
That contentment
it's going to look like real fire too.
Could potentially make him lose a lot of these followers. And since he wasn't going to get a record deal out of Wilson, and since Wilson wasn't planning on climbing on their boss and becoming a full-fledged member, what was the point in remaining in his life? What Charlie needed was a new distraction, something to refocus his family on their purpose, their real calling, what they stood for, which wasn't lounging around a mansion all day, enjoying running water and meals that didn't have to be taken out of a garbage can. While Susan Atkins was still pregnant in late May, he gave her the task of finding a permanent settlement for their family. Swan Ranch was great, but it wasn't owned by them. And George Swan was always kind of sick of having them there. The locals would get annoyed by the hippies lounging all over the place. Some of the ranch hands would complain about the messes that Manson and his family made. So George kind of flip-flopped back and forth about whether he wanted them there or not. And Manson didn't like that unreliability in where their home base would be. They needed a home base, someplace that they knew, no matter how far they traveled, they could always return to. Pat Krenwinkel, Mary, and her little son Pooh Bear, they joined Susan Atkins in their new task, their new goal of finding a headquarters for the family. Now, Susan Atkins was in her glory. Susan had this kind of personality where she really liked being in charge. She liked it being
yeah, the Halloween apple, yeah.
Having that power.
I'll show you here in a sec.
Manson in that
First,
but she
check this
actually
out.
failed miserably at this mission. They rented a place in Philo, California, and the neighbors started calling it the hippie house because the girls who lived there began inviting all the local town's children, most of them minors under the age of 17, to come to the house and party and do drugs and drink alcohol. It wasn't long
I'm
before
still not
the
done yet. I want to
children
do
began
some
to
drips
complain,
down
and
the
police
side of
headed
it
over
too.
to the hippie house to check it out.
I think I'm going to do another smaller candle next to it.
The rental property, experiencing violent delusions from a bad
Oh, but yeah,
atmosphere.
here's
The
the
women were promptly arrested and the baby was put into foster care.
Halloween dab
Now,
tool.
Charlie called Bobby Beausoleil, and he asked him to go over to Philo and rescue his girls, basically. At this
Little
time,
pumpkin.
Bobby Beausoleil was traveling with his
Bobby
girlfriend,
Boucher.
Gail, another
It also fits in
woman
there.
named Catherine Scher, who everybody called Gypsy, and another woman named Leslie Van Houten. Leslie had been brought up in a suburb of California
also
to middle-class
the,
parents who divorced when she was 14.
rabbit
Her
pendant.
father, Paul, was an automotive auctioneer, and her mother, Jane, was a school teacher, and she had an older brother. After Leslie was born, her parents adopted a young boy and girl that had been orphaned
Yeah,
in Korea.
that's all over
And when
here.
they divorced in 1963, Paul moved out, and the children stayed with Jane. Leslie attended Monrovia High School. She played the saxophone in her marching band, and she was elected homecoming queen twice. However, when she discovered LSD and other drugs, her grades began to slip. When she was 17, she ran away from home and she went to the Haight. Like most kids her age at this time, she went to the Haight because she wanted some sort of guidance. But she didn't find it to her liking. It was overcrowded. It was kind of sad. You know, it was the Haight at the time of the free clinic not being able to accommodate everybody's STDs and bacterial infections. So she was like, this isn't for me. When she returned home, she was pregnant, and her mother forced her to have an abortion, which Leslie never forgot about. After she graduated from high school, she went to live with her father, and she attended business college. She wanted to become a legal secretary, but she also wanted to live in a spiritual yogic community. Which I don't know if those two things go hand in hand. I'm not sure how many weeks.
It's the same discount pieces from the other nights.
Yogic communities, but those were her dreams. Really, what she wanted was to leave her family behind forever. She didn't want to have anything to do with any of them anymore. And she visited some friends in San Francisco, and that is where she met Bobby Beausoleil,
Bobby Boucher,
Gal, and Gypsy. She began traveling with them. What better way to show your family that you're done with them than to climb onto some guy's truck with two other girls and join them on their hippie adventure? Now, Gypsy had met Charlie previously when she was with Bobby.
Previously on
and
Charlie
had
Manson.
met in Painted Canyon a little while back. Gypsy had been with Bobby at that time. And both Leslie and Gypsy could kind of sense that their presence in Bobby's life wasn't really appreciated by his girlfriend Gail. When Charlie called Bobby and asked for his help getting his girls out of jail, Gypsy told Leslie all about Charlie, what a magnetic figure he was, how powerful he was. Before going over to Philo, they made a stop at Spawn Ranch to talk to Charlie and get an idea of what kind of needed to be done and the details of the situation. When they got there, Bobby, Gail, and Gypsy all got out of the truck, but Leslie didn't. She kind of was feeling a little bit antisocial. She wasn't really interested in meeting new people, so she hung back for a while. But this was the time where she got her first glimpse of Charlie Manson. She remembered thinking, what's the big deal about this guy? Is this the guy who Gypsy said was so magnetic and powerful? He just looks like a short, dirty hippie to me. I don't see anything special about him. She did, however, think that the girls who lived at the ranch were friendly and made her feel, welcome. So she did like that about the Manson family and Spawn Ranch. Not surprising to me, but I'm sure it was surprising to Bobby and Charlie Manson, who probably thought Bobby was just going to drive over to Philo and snap his fingers, and the police were going to unlock the jail doors, the girls were going to come out and go back with him to the ranch. He was not able to get them out of jail. Why would he be? What did Charlie think that Bobby Beausoleil was going to do? They ended up spending the summer in jail. After that, they were released on time served. And for some reason, when they got out, Mary was able to get her baby back. They made their way back to Los Angeles and to Spawn Ranch, to what I'm sure was a very agitated Charlie Manson, and the idea of finding a more permanent residence was put on hold for now. Now, 1968 was a crazy time. It was full of assassinations, riots, and confusion. After Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated
by the federal government,
Robert Kennedy was murdered the same night he won California's Democratic presidential primary, June 6, 1968. He had been speaking to journalists and supporters at a televised celebration from the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and after he exited through a kitchen hallway, he was shot multiple times. Kennedy had been the youth's hope for change. He was compassionate.
I really like making these candles.
He stood on a platform that include equality for all in the country in opposition to the Vietnam War. A move away from violence and hate towards love and acceptance. The words that he said were everything that the country needed to hear at this time, and they especially resonated with the youth of America. They were spending their days and dedicating their lives to fighting for and believing in the same things when they weren't getting high. And as all of this unfolded in the country, Charlie Manson was getting worse. His entitlement, his rights to everything that Dennis Wilson owned was starting to bug Dennis a little bit. The family didn't seem grateful for the life that Wilson had been providing. They just seemed entitled to it, and it was never enough. Charlie and his girls used Dennis's credit cards. They took his clothes. They ate his food. They even drove his cars. But they didn't take care of those things or treat them with respect. They basically trashed his home, and his $21,000 Mercedes that was uninsured, they totaled it.
No way.
$21,000.
That poor remote, goddammit.
But this was the 60s, so today that car would have been worth over $500,000. Both the Wilson brothers, Brian and Dennis, they had Ferraris.
Look,
to be more specific,
the fire
Ferrari
cooled down enough where you can see the actual color of it.
They loved these cars. Now, the Manson family borrowed Brian Wilson's and crashed it. Later, they also borrowed Dennis Wilson's Ferrari 275 GTB and crashed that while driving around downtown LA. Besides the fact that he completely destroyed his belongings, they also gave him gonorrhea. Now, obviously, nobody knows who gave Dennis Wilson gonorrhea. Somebody brought it into the family. They all slept together.
Who gave Dennis Wilson gonorrhea?
Of the girls. So somebody gave him gonorrhea, and he claimed that all he thought he could do at that point was take the entire family to get penicillin shots because he didn't know who had it or who had given it to him.
I mean,
Wilson said it was probably
pretty good idea at that point.
Gonorrhea bill in history.
They all have it.
He took them over to an LA clinic.
The highest gonorrhea bill in history?
$1,000 in penicillin.
Wait, how much?
So, I mean, needless to say,
$11,000?
they were wearing out their welcome. Charlie was getting agitated with Dennis. Why wasn't he getting signed yet? And Dennis didn't know how to explain to him that even though he believed in him, he couldn't get anybody. He was getting agitated with Dennis. Why? Obviously, nobody knows who gave Dennis Wilson gonorrhea. Somebody brought it into the family. They all slept together, and Dennis slept with multiple of the girls. So somebody gave him gonorrhea, and he claimed that all he thought he could do at that point was take the entire family to get penicillin shots because he didn't know who had it or who had given it to him. Wilson said it was probably
we're banned on TikTok for right now. Until the 19th. We get mass reported a lot.
Gonorrhea bill in history.
It said it could have been.
He took them over to an LA clinic and probably paid over $1,000 in penicillin. So, I mean,
only 1,000. I thought she said 11,000.
They were wearing out their welcome. Charlie was getting agitated with Dennis. Why wasn't he getting signed yet? And Dennis didn't know how to explain to him that even though he believed in him, he couldn't get anybody else to. Wilson, Melcher, and Jacobson had been friends for years. They did a lot of things together. And Manson would get mad when they did things without him, which was they usually did things without him. He didn't understand why he couldn't be considered one of the boys, why he wasn't in their ranks. You know when you meet someone and you fall in love with them, and then one day you wake up and you realize that all the things that you thought you loved about them now annoy the crap out of you?
Damn.
Well, so it went with Wilson and Manson. Manson's determination to Wilson now looked like aggressiveness, and the way he was with the women now seemed a little creepy to Wilson, especially when Manson tried to recruit one of Wilson's girlfriends. Manson would constantly make advances at this girl, even though she made it clear she wasn't interested in having sex with him or being one of his concubines. One of the times that she denied him, Manson pulled a knife on her and told her that he could cut her into little pieces. Even after she told this to Dennis, he kind of scared Dennis a little bit, but he was like, that's just Charlie. He's always got a knife on him. He's kind of nuts. He still let Manson and the girls live at his home. And even though Manson made it seem to his followers that he was on the cusp of getting a record deal and becoming famous, he knew that Terry Melcher was not going to sign him, and he wasn't really impressed with his music. He knew that Dennis Wilson was the only one in his corner, and that wasn't enough. There was a documentary that came out last year. It was called Inside the Manson Cult, The Lost Tapes. And this was actually a documentary crew who followed Manson and his family around at Spawn Ranch. There's over 100 hours of this footage. If you're interested in seeing this documentary, I liked it. It's narrated by Liev Schreiber, who I really like as an actor, and I like his voice. And there's a lot of really good interviewees in this documentary. They interview Gypsy, Catherine Sher. They interview Diane Lake, John Douglas, the FBI criminal profiler. He has a lot to say in there as well, and it's just very telling. And it's interesting to see them in their natural habitat, like as they were at that time. But in this documentary, they asked Paul Watkins if Terry Melcher thought that Manson was good enough. Paul responds no, and Charlie didn't like that at all. So Manson knew that Terry wasn't like a big fan of the Charlie Manson show. And it was becoming pretty clear that Dennis Wilson didn't have the pull or the authority to get him what he wanted. But Dennis Wilson did try, and he even did set up Charlie and the girls with a recording studio and some time and somebody to produce them. And when Charlie went into a recording studio, it was more clear than ever that he was a fish out of water, that this wasn't his scene, he didn't belong there. He would be instructed, as is typical,
we need to do more of this.
Recording in a studio, to get closer to the mic or tune his guitar in a different way. And instead of using this as constructive criticism to make the music better, which was what that was for, he took it as a personal attack against him and his music. He put on the airs of an established artist when he wasn't. He would come in and, make everybody wait for him. He would demand things. He would get upset if he wasn't getting the result that he wanted.
Isn't that so great?
One night, the session that they were having wasn't going well.
I'm gonna do one more
The man who
candle
was recording them
on the very
suggested
top.
that they wrap it up for
A
the
little
night.
smaller, I think.
Charlie didn't like that. He pulled a knife on him. Everybody else besides Manson walked away from these recording sessions knowing not only that he was crazy, but that he just wasn't good enough to make it.
Refresh your home with the help of Living Spaces Grand Prairie, located at the George Bush Turnpike at Arkansas Lane. Upgrade
45 minutes left in the stream. I dropped our remote again. I'm not gonna put it there.
Well, Manson, even
Should be enough
after all
to
of
finish
this,
that piece.
even after throwing fits, even after pulling a knife on someone, he walked away thinking that he killed it. Manson was like Fergie after singing the national anthem at the All-Stars game. Everybody else was confused, and he was like, nailed it.
I have no idea what you mean,
He thought
Brian.
these performances he gave would be sure to snag him a recording contract. However, the only thing that was salvageable from these sessions was the tune Cease to Exist, which Dennis Wilson actually thought was pretty good. He thought it was so good that he decided to take it to the Beach Boys and record it for one of their albums after tweaking it quite a bit and polishing it up, of course, which Charlie didn't know about until the song came out. He had no idea that Dennis Wilson had changed anything about the song. He thought that Dennis had taken the song as is, music and lyrics, recorded it, put it on the album, and he was flattered. Now, the Beach Boys went on a short tour in the summer of '68, and while Dennis Wilson was gone, the family continued to stay at his house. They also took it upon themselves to use his credit card. That was not his credit card, but his credit card
pretty good
through
leak
his record
right here,
label,
so I might.
and they racked up quite a bit of debt. When Wilson returned a week later, he was greeted with questions from his label about how he had managed to spend $800 at a local dairy when he hadn't even been in town.
Gotta figure something
This
out about
prompted Dennis to start kind of adding up how much the family had cost him. in their brief stay with him during the summer. And the figure that he came up with
streaming
was over
blowing glass are my
$100,000.
main
And even though he was upset
salaries.
with the credit card thing, with the cars being crashed,
the streaming
with just
isn't making
their
much money right
general
now,
sense of
not being on
entitlement,
TikTok.
he did not want to
YouTube
directly
being
confront
weird.
Charlie with these transgressions. He still considered them friends, and I think he was a little scared of them. Now, you will read reports from people who knew Dennis Wilson who say he was never afraid of Manson, he was never afraid of the family. But I don't personally believe that. I think if you spend enough time with Manson, as Wilson did, you would have to be a little terrified of his hold over people, of the way he constantly carries around a knife and isn't afraid to threaten people with it. So instead of asking them to leave the house, Dennis just left the house. He gathered up some of his belongings, obviously not everything, and knowing that the lease on the house was going to be up in a couple weeks anyways, he left. He got a smaller apartment over the Pacific Coast Highway, just big enough for him, not big enough for overnight guests, certainly. And at first he didn't tell Manson and the family where he was because he kind of just wanted to be left alone. And he didn't want to be around when they got kicked out of the house a couple weeks later when the lease was up. And the owner of the house was like, you guys have to leave. When they were removed from the home, the family made sure that they took every last thing that Dennis Wilson had to offer. Anything in that house that they could carry, they took with them, including many gold records from the Beach Boys. At this point, they had about 35 followers, and they settled onto Spawn Ranch permanently. And when I say permanently, I mean this is pretty much where they were living, but they still traveled all over the place and looked for other places to stay. Now, Manson had told Tex Watson that he still had too much ego to be a part of the family, and he had to erase all traces of his ego before becoming a full-fledged member. Tex still was not considered a full member of the Manson family. So in order for Tex to prove his worth, to prove that he didn't think he was better than anybody, Manson enlisted him with building these temporary shelters to accommodate their growing population. And Tex Watson, who really wanted to be a part of them, he spent every waking moment tirelessly working to prove to Manson and everybody else that he had sufficiently abandoned his ego enough to be welcomed into their group. Spawn Ranch was a better place for Charlie to have his followers. It was his Guyana, essentially. It was more remote. It separated from everything. It wasn't Dennis Wilson's house where people were always dropping over and visiting. They didn't have a TV. They didn't know what was happening in the outside world. He didn't allow clocks. He didn't allow calendars. He didn't allow watches. He wanted them to kind of just not know anything else that was happening outside besides what he told them was happening outside. Staying at Dennis's had been fun, certainly, and luxurious. But there were so many things going on to take the attention of the family off of Charlie. But here in the desert, he could sit and preach to them for hours and hours and hours. And they pretty much had to listen because there was nothing else to do. Now, the growing membership in the family included Gypsy and Leslie.
Oh, the larger cup is an ashtray with a dabber in it.
Sitting in Bobby's truck and listening to him and Gail argue constantly. So they decided to go to Spawn Ranch and join up with Charlie. At first, Charlie turned them away and said, no, you can't stay here. He didn't want to upset Bobby, who was still a friend of his, and Gypsy was 20 years old at that time, and he liked his girls a little bit younger. And Leslie was very intelligent, and he usually liked his girls a little dumber. But in the end, he relented. They were both very pretty. Gypsy was very good with people, and he thought that between Gypsy's people skills and Leslie's looks, that they could help him recruit more people. Leslie also served a purpose to Charlie because she'd gone to school to be a secretary, so she had really good writing skills, and he would basically have her follow him around all day long so she could write down song lyrics that he said out loud. He would always get frustrated because he'd always have these brilliant ideas that would pop into his head for songs, and he'd be like, this is the best song ever, but he couldn't really read or write. So he didn't have the ability to take these songs and, put them on paper.
I keep forgetting that about him.
Around, and as
fucking dude was illiterate.
Lyrics, she would be responsible for writing them down, which was a very frustrating job because oftentimes he would just kind of make these sounds or these series of sounds, and then she would be responsible for having to translate this series of sounds into words on paper. And Charlie had a favorite bedtime story that he would tell his followers. And fairy tales were created to keep children obedient, to keep them from getting into trouble. So Charlie told the story about a king and a queen. The king and the queen had a routine. Every day, the king would ask the queen to make him a sandwich, and she would. But one day, when the king asked the queen to make his sandwich, the queen said she was tired today. Could he make his own sandwich? He said he would, and as he went to go make the sandwich, the queen called after him, hey, while you're there making your sandwich, you think you can make me a sandwich too? Which he did, and he brought her her sandwich. From that day forth, the routine was switched. Now, the king was making his own sandwich and making the queen a sandwich. And that is what women do that they should not do. They try to troll men and manipulate them with their femininity. That's
with
why
their
modern society
femininity.
was crumbling, because too many men were letting too many women run the show. Like the Manson family, they would not fall into that trap. They would not be the parable that he told them. There would be no question about who was in charge, who was there to lead, and who was there to serve. I mean, I looked everywhere for it, and I couldn't find any story that was exactly like this. I definitely think he made it up, which is funny because if you're gonna make a story about a king and a queen, you're thinking like medieval stuff, right? Like knights, dragons, castles. I would have said he wanted a roasted pig's head every day, not a sandwich. I just don't see like a king and a queen sitting around eating turkey sandwiches. That's just my little criticism of your story, Charlie. Now, in September of 1968, Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys recorded Cease to Exist, but they changed the title to Never Learn Not to Love. He also changed the lyrics, which was a big problem to Charlie, who had told Dennis, you gotta change the music up, that's fine, but the lyrics need to stay as is. And Dennis Wilson had led him to believe that that's what happened. When Dennis Wilson told Charlie that Cease to Exist or Never Learn Not to Love was going to be on the B-side of their next album, he failed to mention the title change, or the lyric change, or the fact that Dennis gave himself full songwriting credit. He figured Charlie would find out later and be mad, but he also figured that he'd already given Charlie and his family over $100,000 worth of his money and belongings and time. So what more could Charlie really ask for? This song was basically a repayment for that. And when Charlie heard the song, he was pissed. But at first he kept his cool because he was still hoping that Dennis Wilson was going to hook him up with Terry. He was panicking because he had not seen Terry out at clubs or at parties for a while now. And there was a reason that Terry Melcher was laying low and was too busy for Charlie Manson or anybody else. Terry was distracted by some personal issues that his mother, Doris Day, was going through and that he was trying to help her sort through. By the time Doris Day was 27, she was already working on her third marriage. Terry was just 7 when Doris married her third husband, Marty Melcher. At this point, Terry's life kind of changed because, for the most part, he had been raised by his grandmother because Doris Day was an actress and she was constantly working, so he'd been staying with his grandmother. But when Doris married Marty, they all moved in together, Terry began to live and was kind of overwhelmed by the amount of time he was now spending with his mother. Life as he had known it for his entire 7 years was completely different. But Doris Day had this vision of a perfect life and a wholesome woman, the kind that she projected to the public, but she never really had then. She wanted to focus on being a good wife and a good mother while still acting and making money. And her new husband, Marty, was also her agent, so it was going to work out perfectly, right? 4 years, Doris Day would work tirelessly on project after project, movie after movie. And even though people warned her that her husband was funneling money from her, she ignored them. Marty was a good husband, she said. Hadn't he legally adopted her son and given him his last name? Sure, he could be a little controlling and extremely jealous at times, but what man wasn't? She began experiencing panic attacks, which were exacerbated by the fact that she found a lump in one of her breasts. He began throwing herself into religion for comfort and guidance. Christian Science religion, to be specific. which doesn't believe in conventional medicine, instead leaning toward spiritual healing. So she never went to a doctor for her lump or her anxiety issues. Meanwhile, Marty Melcher and his business partner, Jerry Rosenthal, were in fact stealing all her earnings from the movies that she was doing, all of them. And Marty was physically and mentally abusive to Terry. He would slap him around and call him a sissy in public to humiliate him. Doris's health just got worse, and even when she was hemorrhaging on set, Marty, who also believed in the Christian Science religion, would not let her go to see a doctor. Only when the pain became so bad she could barely stand anymore, he relented and allowed her to check herself in to a hospital. This was when it was discovered that she had a huge intestinal tumor that needed to be removed. And part of this surgery involved a hysterectomy, which broke Doris. She'd always wanted to have more children, and now she knew that she couldn't. This only caused her anxiety and her depression, and
switch and save $652. It's okay. There's enough for everyone.
Kind of a necessary tool. Glad we're getting a new one.
her emotional issues to become worse. When Terry was 20 years old, he begged his mother to leave the man who had been abusing him for years. When she tried to, Marty told her that if she left him, she would become bankrupt because he controlled all her money. Terry moved out, and Doris and Marty began living separate lives. They slept in different bedrooms. They had their own relationships outside of the marriage, but they remained married. Even though their marriage was over, even though this man had lied to her and stolen from her and treated her and her son poorly, when he became very ill, Doris took care of him. And when he became too sick to be cared for in their home any longer, she stayed with him in the hospital for 2 weeks. Till one day, on April 20th, 1968, Marty Melcher died at the age of 52 from a heart attack. Soon after, while she was still mourning her husband and hiding away from the public eye, Doris Day received something troubling in the mail. It was a tax demand for over $500,000. She had never handled any of her own financials. She assumed everything had been getting paid, and she also assumed that she had plenty of money in the bank to cover this tax demand. However, when she checked into it, she found that she had no money in the bank. None. She called her son, now grown and running a business of his own, to help her get to the bottom of it. After they investigated it, they discovered that she was completely broke. Marty and Rosenthal had been embezzling Day's earnings for over 15 years, placing the money in offshore accounts, and when Marty died, all that money became in the control of Jerry Rosenthal. When Manson was looking around for Terry Melcher, trying to get him to listen to his music and give him a shot, Melcher was deeply embroiled in his mother's drama, trying to basically keep her head over water. He was going through her financials and spearheading a lawsuit against Rosenthal, trying to regain some of the money that had been lost. So the recording contract would have to be on hold until Manson could locate Terry. But what would they do in the meantime? What would they talk about? What would their goal be? To keep them distracted, to keep them tired, to keep them following him? Well, Manson had to tell them that something big was coming, something that would unite them against a common enemy, which was Helter Skelter. Now, with all the racial tensions going on, with the riots happening in their own backyard, not to mention all over the country, Manson thought that this would eventually reach a head. The blacks would eventually get so tired of being oppressed by the whites and being pushed around that they would rise up, and nearly every single white person would be murdered. The blacks would then take over the world. It would be a huge war. There would be death and violence and just complete chaos.
Death and despair.
But in the end, the blacks would win. They would be victorious, but they weren't that smart, right? According to Manson, they weren't that smart. So they would not be able to govern themselves and rule for too long. Where did this leave Manson and his family? Well, they were going to find a bottomless pit in the desert, and underneath the bottomless pit, there was an enchanted city where they could all live out their days as they waited for the blacks to tire themselves out trying to run the world, and then they could emerge from the pit ready to step in as world rulers. Now, Charlie said this could take years. This could take hundreds of years. All of this happened. They needed to be in this pit when the war went down because they couldn't have this violence. They couldn't have a chance of something happening to them. So they needed to already be in the pit. And it could take hundreds of years for this to all come to a head and for them to be ready to take over. But that was okay because this enchanted city, you didn't age in this enchanted city and you could evolve into anything you wanted, like a fairy. Manson theorized that maybe Helter Skelter would start by the blacks breaking into the homes of rich whites and murdering them and maybe writing things on the walls in their blood. But this was coming, regardless of how it would start and how it would end. It was coming, and they had to prepare for it. It was February of 1969 when Manson and his family started preparing for Helter Skelter.
We'll come off, but I was just
Polanski
melting everything
and
in.
his new wife, Sharon Tate, were also preparing for life changes of their own. Terry Melcher and Candice Bergen had recently broken up, and they had moved out of 1005 Cielo Drive. Rudy Altobelli, who was the owner of the home and lived in the guest house and acted as a caretaker, he received a call from Sharon Tate on February 12th asking about the property. She was pregnant. They were going to have a baby.
Catching up on
and
chat
needed
right
some
now.
more space for their growing family. 3 days later, on February 15th,
I think I watched an
Sharon
episode of
and Roman
She-Hulk.
moved into the Cielo Drive
Well, it's
property.
positive I did.
They thought the place was perfect for all the parties and gatherings they would have there. And Roman was often out of town for work, so there was plenty of room for Sharon's friends to stay, so she wouldn't be alone when he wasn't there. Sharon Tate was a gorgeous woman who was very close to her family. Her father had been in the military, so she moved around a lot and learned to make friends quickly wherever she went. Her mother remembers that she had that something special even as a baby, saying that strangers used to stop in the streets to stare at little Sharon, and she won her very first beauty pageant at the age of 6 months, being named Miss Tiny Tot of Dallas, Texas. In 1966, she met Roman Polanski, who was directing The Fearless Vampire Killers. She was suggested for the lead role, and at first Polanski didn't think she was right for it, but after screen testing her, he began to see that she was not only beautiful, but would also be great for the role, so he hired her. During filming, the two got very close. But the problem was that Sharon was already dating someone, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring. Eventually, the connection between Roman and herself became so undeniable, she knew she had to break it off with Jay. According to reports, Jay understood, but he wanted to meet Roman first to make sure that Sharon, who he did care very deeply for, would be taken care of. The three had dinner, and at the end of it, Jay shook Roman's hand and told him he was a good guy, and allegedly the three continued a very close friendship in the years after that.
Good for them.
Roman and Sharon
That's very
had a
mature
very
of him.
close and affectionate relationship. She would tell him that he was the better half, and Roman thought that Sharon was too nice and didn't believe in herself enough. She was one of those beautiful women who didn't think she was beautiful, so she remained humble and kind to everyone. Roman tells the story of when he was in his native Poland and he bought a nice pair of shoes, but he was embarrassed to wear the shoes because all his friends had plain shoes. He likened Sharon's beauty to those shoes, as she was almost embarrassed of it. Sharon was cast in Valley of the Dolls, which if you haven't read the book, I enjoyed the book. The movie was not so good, but the book is very interesting and entertaining. Sharon wasn't impressed with the story. She considered it trashy and not the artistic work she really wanted to be doing, and she was right. The movie never really lived up to the book, and the critics never took it seriously. Fun fact, Candy Bergen, who was Terry Melcher's girlfriend at that time, she was also considered for one of the lead roles in Valley of the Dolls, Small World. Roman proposed to Sharon in January of 1968 in their hometown of London, and in late 1968 she was thrilled to discover that she was pregnant, which is what caused them to need a larger home, which is what brought them to Cielo Drive, which Sharon called their love home.
Alright,
Okay,
it's a little
so
too
I
strong
think that I'm going
propane
to
smell
end
in
part
here. I need to go
here.
ahead and swap
There's
out
so much more to cover, guys.
this line.
But we have to keep them at least under an hour and a half, or they will take forever to upload. Anyways, I will get part 4 out to you by this coming week. Just a couple of days, hopefully. If this goes out on Sunday or Monday, I expect to have part 4 up by midweek. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments what you think.
Part 4. We'll hang out for another 20 minutes, 24 minutes.
Braided hair.
Hyaluronic
While
acid
I
to your
try to
hair.
start swapping this up.
Hyaluron Pump by L'Oreal Paris.
I wasn't gonna I didn't plan on finishing that pumpkin tonight anyways. We still got a bit to do on it.
Ooh, cherries. Oh, okay. How about cherry ice cream?
I'm not gonna skip this ad with Lizzo.
And a French boy.
And a French boy.
Charger.
Blast her in the face with talking fucking crumbs.
Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel and welcome to part 4 of the Manson family video. Before we get started, I wanted to take a quick moment and talk about our sponsor for this video. It's Annalisa Jewelry.
Actually, first,
so
I'm
last
gonna
week
take
I
this
was
off.
doing a video and I was wearing a silver necklace and I had a bunch of people ask where I got the necklace from. And our
Sorry. I'm gonna go to the information. Sorry, I'm glad you have sponsors. Super proud of you.
as a part of a mining operation, and you basically would get your water from a creek nearby, and the only electricity that you had access to was from a windmill, and it really didn't provide a good source of electricity. So essentially they would be living in a very remote, very hard to find area. You would have to drive a very long time to get back to civilization. And people really weren't too happy about it. They had come from Dennis Wilson's mansion to Spawn Ranch, which, you know, it wasn't a mansion, but at least it was kind of fun. And now Charlie wanted them to, you know, eventually end up in Barker Ranch, which was literally the middle of nowhere. But Charlie told them that this was where the bottomless pit was, in Death Valley, somewhere nearby. Bottomless pit with the enchanted city underneath could be found. They needed to prepare for the coming war. The cities were going to be absolutely outrageous and full of violence and death. So they couldn't be there. They had to be in the middle of nowhere. They had to be at Barker Ranch in the middle of Death Valley,
all the lines
where the bottomless pit was located. And one of their jobs when they were at Barker was to find the bottomless pit. They also had to learn to survive in the desert. They had to carry a knife with them at all times for protection and learn how to walk across the sand without leaving footprints. One of their jobs was to scout places between Spawn and Barker Ranch where they could hide food stores. And the dune buggies, guys, the dune buggies. This is, you can't make this up. Charlie and his family would steal VWs, bugs, and the occasional Porsche, and basically rip them apart and turn them into a vehicle that could function in the desert, because normal cars couldn't.
Trigger warning, I will be using a razor blade.
You had to have a dune buggy. So in order to make sure that he could get everyone safely from Spawn to Barker Ranch, when Helter
Not the typical looking ones, a workman's razor blade, so
making sure
it's different,
that Barker was
but
ready,
just wanted to let
and
you
that
know.
they were able to find this bottomless pit. He had to have
Cutting away
vehicles
from
that could
myself,
function
don't
in the
worry.
desert. So he basically tricked out these cars into dune buggies that could function in the desert. They had this entire elevated, really well planned and thought out chop shop basically behind Spawn Ranch, where some people would go and steal the cars and then bring them to Spawn Ranch where they would be put in the back, and then Charlie and Tex, who were very good with cars, and a bunch of the other guys would just tear them apart and put in water-cooled engines so that the dune buggies wouldn't overheat in the extreme temperatures of the desert. It was really brilliant, actually. He had the idea, if you were going to survive in Death Valley, you needed dune buggies. So they had an army of dune buggies that were mostly from stolen vehicles. But at first you have to understand, the way that he was posing this whole helter-skelter thing to his followers was that they were just trying to survive the coming violence. They didn't want to be a part of it. They just needed to hide out and wait it out. So it's not really surprising that so many people still kind of went along with this idea. There wasn't any talk about murdering anybody just yet. There wasn't talk about, you know, setting up the Black Panthers just yet. He just said, we've got to get through this so that we can hide out in the Enchanted City and then come back as elevated and evolved beings to run the world. That part, I am surprised that they kind of went along with. They were on so many drugs though, so many psychedelic drugs. The women who were told by Charlie that when they got to the Enchanted City in the bottomless pit, they could evolve to whatever they wanted, they really wanted to be fairies. And as time passed, with Charlie telling the story about the city and where they would go and what they would become, the girls started to say that they could feel little nuts on their back.
I'm turning into a
where
fairy.
the wings would protrude when they finally evolved to their final fairy form.
In a cut that I
So
already
it kind
had
of gives you an
something.
indication of what the mental state of these people were at the time, almost childlike. The kind of imagination that only a very young child can have. When I was maybe 7, 8, I used to go outside and ride my bike. And I would actually believe, once I imagined it enough, that the bike was a pony. And I named it Starburst because that was the name of the bike. And I took chalk and I made a chalk village with like a general store and a post office and little chalk streets. And I would drive my bike / horse along these streets, and I believed that I was riding a pony. The way that their minds were functioning was at the level of a very young child. The imaginative young child that I believe eventually we grow out of, which is very sad, because it was really fun to imagine something so ferociously that you actually started believing it. But when you become an adult and it's a crazy person who's telling you these stories and who's giving you these visions and these imaginings, it's
They them
dangerous.
pronouns for me.
These girls especially
I'm
were
swapping
becoming so
out,
naive, so childlike,
I'm gonna
not
swap out
thinking
this
for
tubing. It had a
themselves,
leak.
just living in this
Little propane
dream
leak.
world that he'd created for them. Now, Tex Watson, in November of 1968, he had left the family for a little bit, and he moved in with a girlfriend whose name was Luella, and he actually lived the opposite of a hippie life. He and Luella were selling drugs, and they were making quite a bit of money, so
Sprouts Farmers Market. Great prices on the freshest produce and so much more.
Fuck kind of attitude.
So, you know, he had a fancy haircut, he wore fancy clothes, they would go out to fancy restaurants for dinner, they lived in a nice apartment with all these amenities, and he was kind of living this more sleek LA Playboy style life instead of the hippie life that he'd been living on Spawn Ranch. But eventually, when the relationship between Tex and Luella began to fail and go downhill, he went back to Manson in March of 1968 and asked to be welcomed back into the family. He missed the community, he missed the more simple and basic life that he'd had
So I'm
with
gonna need to
Manson
separate
and the girls.
the oxygen
Manson
from the
forgave
propane.
him for leaving and welcomed him back. Well, mostly it was because he needed his automotive skills and his manpower, because he really needed to get those dune buggies ready for doomsday. And in mid-March, the news that Manson had been waiting for finally arrived. Terry Melcher would be visiting Spawn Ranch to listen to Manson play, finally. Orders were given to the family to get the ranch in tip-top shape for Melcher's arrival. Everything else had to be put on hold to make sure they were ready for him, which confused people. Wasn't Helter Skelter kind of the more immediate concern? Wasn't doomsday coming? Weren't we trying to find this bottomless pit and learn to walk on the sand without leaving footprints? And didn't there need to be dune buggies made? What's the most important thing on your priority list right now, Charlie?
Buggies or something?
The apocalypse is coming. You told us that. But now, Terry Melcher's coming to hear you play, and we have to put everything on hold to get ready for that? But why does it matter if you're going to get signed to a record contract when you've told us that the world as we know it is going to end anyways? But as I said,
You're losing the plot, Charlie.
Things through. They didn't use logic. There was often times when he would contradict himself. And if even a spark appeared in these people's minds where they were like, that doesn't make sense, you know, it was quickly extinguished by the amount of drugs they were on or by his charisma. They really were already taught to not question him, so even if they thought it, they didn't ever really vocalize it. So they prepared for Terry Melcher's arrival, and they tried to clean the ranch, even though it was in the desert.
I shouldn't have any ads on my
so it was pretty much a futile
on my
task.
videos
And
unless
Charlie
I
even
was
prepared
monetized.
himself. He bathed, and he trimmed his hair. And he had a new suit made for
Let me
him
check.
out of
Did they
deerskin,
approve our
which was an
monetization?
extravagant expense that they couldn't really afford at that time. Now, Charlie did not believe in
Do y'all usually
killing
get
animals,
ads?
so he had the deerskin ordered. I guess little details like the fact that somebody had to kill the deer in order for the skin to be available for Charlie to order were lost on him. He was a big picture kind of guy. At this same time, Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were making preparations of their own and getting ready for a housewarming party they were going to be throwing on March 15th.
The
guest list included all the big names in the industry at that time. Tony Curtis, all of the mamas and the papas, Jane and Peter Fonda, Warren Beatty. Also invited to this party were Sharon's core group of friends and acquaintances that she spent most of her time
this out, I'm gonna take a look at the
her old beau and longtime friend Jay Sebring. Thomas John Coomer was born to a middle-class family in Birmingham, Alabama. And after serving in the Navy, he moved to LA, where he changed his name to Jay Sebring. J for the first initial
still in progress.
and
We have
Sebring
not
after the Sebring International Raceway in
yet.
Florida. Once in California, he attended beauty school, and he invented a new way of cutting men's hair, which included shampooing the hair before cutting it and using scissors instead of clippers. Jay Sebring honestly has a very interesting story. I wish we could go into more detail, but like I said, this would go on forever. Jay Sebring had a very illustrious and colorful and fun life. But anyways, he invented this new way of cutting hair, and it became very, very popular.
No worries. I
And
needed
he
to check it
charged
anyways.
for the privilege of having your hair cut the Jay Sebring way in a time where most men went to the barbershop and paid $1 or $2
when
for a haircut.
my ads
Jay
that
Sebring
come
was
through
charging
here.
over $50 to have a hair cut his way. He was the stylist for the stars like Stephen Queen, Warren Beatty, Kirk Douglas. He even would fly out to Las Vegas every 2 weeks to cut the hair of Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra. He wasn't very tall. He was only about 5'6", but Jay Sebring had this really handsome, boyish quality about him. Dark hair, dark eyes, beautiful smile. He was charming and he was very good with the ladies. He really liked cars, so he had a Mustang Cobra, and sometimes he drove around a black Porsche.
Trying to figure out, I don't think there's really anything we can do about it right now.
Hollywood circles, but he was also a devoted friend to Sharon Tate. He really, really cared about her. Wojtek Frykowski was a friend of Roman's from Poland who had already been married twice when he met Abigail Folger in New York City. Abigail was the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and even though Wojtek did not speak English, Abigail, who was born into wealth and
I might be able to
was
use
fluent in
this.
French, which he spoke as well. The two lived in New York City for a while, but in August of 1968 they headed west,
because I don't want to just throw the rest of this tubing away. I'm going to have to cut this off. I'm going to cut this off right here because the other end of this tubing here does have a leak. If this has a leak, I probably can't use this anymore at all. This end over here. I'll try to clean it and see if the seal will get better, but either way, I do have to cut this right here. We have the new tubing over there.
And the papas. Wojtek didn't seem to want to work for a living. He kept a diary where he would make notes about American customs, so it seemed like he might want to be a writer, but I don't think he ever really followed through with that. He also worked as a set constructor at Paramount Studios for a little bit, but he quit because he didn't like that. Basically, it seemed like he was just living off of Abigail's money, and there are rumors and stories that say he was embezzling some of it as well. But he seemed to like being in LA. He was close to his old friend Roman. They'd known each other for years, and he would often bring his girlfriend, Abigail Folger, to the Polanski residence where she became close with Roman and Sharon as well. The two would actually house sit for the couple when they were away in April of 1969. And when they got back, Wojtek asked Roman and Sharon if it would be okay if he and Abigail just kind of stayed at the Cielo Drive house for a little bit. And Sharon, who was often alone because Roman was out of town a lot and who was very kind-hearted, agreed to it. Now, Abigail Folger, in my opinion, was a shining star in the world. Yes, she came from money. Yes, she, was an heiress, and she had education. She graduated from Harvard. She had everything that she could ever want or need, but she had learned from her mother to give back to the less fortunate. Abigail's mother was very into volunteering and community service work. The two of them worked together in the summer of '68 at the free clinic in the Haight, helping people who didn't have money or health insurance. And Abigail spent most of her time volunteering as a social worker for the LA County Welfare Department. She was also an investor in Jay Sebring's company, Sebring International. She worked a lot in the poor areas of LA, like the Watts area, where the big riot had happened. And she began to get so discouraged by seeing, especially the kids, and how they didn't have what they needed, and how, society had kind of turned their backs on them. It really got her down. She really felt it strongly and heavily. And she knew that just being the one person that she was, she couldn't help everybody. In order to cheer herself up, she got herself a Dalmatian puppy named Tom. These murders were called the Tate murders, so it's not uncommon for Sharon Tate to be the one highlighted when people think about the Manson family and who they killed. It's always Sharon Tate, which obviously is sad. She was an amazing person in her own right, and she didn't deserve what happened to her. But there were other victims. And Jay Sebring was an incredibly talented young man who was going places. And Abigail Folger was a very kind-hearted, giving and caring person whose life was cut short for absolutely no reason, for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's always very important to remember the other people that this happened to. It wasn't just Sharon Tate there that night. The day after the housewarming party, Roman left to go to London. He was working on a movie there. And on March 24th, Sharon would be leaving to go to Rome. She was still working, and this was kind of going to be the last thing that she did before she had the baby.
Look at that.
The day before she left, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Jay Sebring, and a photographer friend of Sharon's all gathered at the home to have a going-away dinner for her. Now, the name of Sharon Tate's photographer friend, who's also one of her personal photographers, his name was Shahrokh Hatimi. I hope I said that right, but I probably didn't, so don't come for me. But as they all sat in the dining room having dinner, the group noticed that there was a strange man walking around on the property. So Hatimi went outside and asked the guy, like, what do you want? What are you doing here? This man was Charles Manson, an angry Charles Manson, who had shown up to the Cielo Drive home looking for Terry Melcher, who had not shown up to Spawn Ranch when he was supposed to hear him sing. Manson had sent his family into a tizzy, dropping everything to prepare for the arrival of a man that never showed up and never called or let anybody know why. And it was embarrassing to Manson to be stood up that way. Terry Melcher had embarrassed Manson in front of his following, and he was there now to tell him off and make him come back with him to Spawn Ranch so that the family could see Manson still had control over the situation. When Manson told Hatimi that he was looking for Terry Melcher, the photographer told him no one by that name lives here. This is the Polanski residence, but maybe the person you're looking for is in the guest house. As Manson turned to go, Sharon Tate walked outside and asked Hatimi who it was. And at this point, it's believed that Sharon and Manson, did make eye contact and saw each other for the first and last time. Now, Rudy Altobelli was in the shower when Manson walked up onto the porch of the guest cottage at Cielo Drive. And when he got out, he saw him standing outside. And he opened the door and he said, "What do you want?" Manson tried to explain to him who he was and why he was there, and Rudy interrupted him and was like, "Yeah, Charlie, I know who you are. What do you want?" Manson explained to Rudy that he was there looking for Melcher and they had some business to settle. And Rudy told Manson he doesn't live here anymore. And when Manson asked him, where does he live now, Rudy lied and said he didn't know. But he would really like it if Manson would avoid coming onto the property and annoying his tenants or bothering his tenants from now on. The next day, Sharon Tate and Rudy Altobelli, they flew together to Rome, and Manson got everybody back on track, looking towards Helter Skelter and getting those dune buggies ready. Not only did they need more dune buggies, but the women really needed to try to get pregnant more often. They were going to need 144,000 people, as told by the Book of Revelations. That was the number that they would need before they were able to emerge and take over the world. So they really needed to get started. I'm not quite sure how Charlie thought that, a dozen or maybe 15 women were going to get pregnant and give birth to 144,000 people, but maybe in the Enchanted City under the desert, you only have to be pregnant for 12 days like a possum, so you can really knock
you have to be pregnant for 12 days as a possum?
In almost a year to actually give birth.
Skip by that fucking information.
That was their part, and that's what
you want to see the best part of this?
And let's get back to Tex Watson for a moment, because Tex's story, it just continues to get
I'm not going to do that all the way down.
According to testimony from Paul Watkins, Paul and Manson were driving through the desert one day when a man came out and kicked them off his property. Manson got mad and wanted to poison the man. So he asked Paul, did Paul know about any poisons that were close by that they could use? And Paul, who had spent some time on an Indian reservation when he was younger, in fact did know where they could find some poison. He had seen some belladonna growing in the hills around Spawn Ranch, and he knew very well
isn't the right size,
what
I'm gonna shit all
belladonna
over the
could
place.
do to a person. So Paul Watkins dug up some belladonna and he gave it to another member named Brenda to boil into a tea, which allegedly he would then give to the man who kicked Charlie and Paul off his property.
That's
Why
not the
this
right
man would
size. Not
accept tea
this.
from
This
them
is
and
the right
drink it, I'm not
size.
sure, but that was the plan. But as they were doing this, Tex Watson walked into the kitchen. He was on his way out to go pick up his motorcycle from impound, and he thought that the belladonna root looked like sweet potatoes. So he grabbed a big chunk and started eating it, and he told them like, oh hey, I'm gonna go get my bike, I'll be back later, and left. Now Paul Watkins remembered the last time he saw Tex was when Tex was walking out of the kitchen chewing on this belladonna root. I'm not sure why Paul or Brenda didn't say, hey, that's not sweet potatoes, you probably shouldn't eat that, it's either gonna kill you or make you go crazy, but they didn't, and Tex left to go get his bike. Nobody saw him again for 3 days. Belladonna, or nightshade, is a very powerful hallucinogen. And the next thing Tex knew, he was being arrested in Van Nuys for public intoxication. He was crawling on his hands and knees through a group of children saying, beep, beep. Tex was taken, he was fingerprinted, but he wasn't really even able to sign his own name. He was so out of it and crazy. This was the worst trip that somebody could have been on. He was making crazy faces and grimaces in his mugshot when he got arrested. And then he was put in a cell with a bunch of other prisoners who had no time or patience for a cellmate who was gonna act like a complete lunatic for the whole time. So they beat the crap out of him and he had to be hospitalized. He was released the next day, but his fingerprints were still on file, and Tex's friends and family members claim that after this belladonna incident, he was never the same. His personality had changed.
Not even gonna keep trying.
He was harder, meaner, more bullying, more aggressive.
Trying to figure out how though.
And now he considered himself Charlie's right-hand man, which Charlie didn't mind because he liked this new restless, violent, aggressive Tex Watson. Charlie and his family really needed money. They were desperate. So they had a couple plans and none of them really turned out well. The first one that we're going to talk about is when Charlie opened up a bar in the saloon on Spawn Ring.
This just isn't the right piece. This piece here.
He painted it black, he painted some psychedelic symbols on the wall, and played Beatles music, put some beer on ice, and called the bar Helter Skelter. It was actually pretty popular for a couple of days with the ranch hands and the local kids, but after only a couple of days, the authorities caught on, they shut it down, and they slapped George Spawn with a $1,500 fine for illegally operating a bar. So Manson started an alliance with a group of bikers called the Straight Satans. He was hoping that he could partner with them and make a profit selling drugs. They would work together to sling drugs and split the profits, and Charlie would throw in his women as an added bonus. The bikers had their pick of any girls that they wanted, but Charlie also threw in Ruth Ann Morehouse and Leslie Van Houten to sweeten the deal. They were considered the prettiest girls and the ones he usually reserved for special occasions to draw on the big fish for the special guests of the family. But with the introduction of the Straight Satans into the family's dynamic, a lot of the members now had access to harder drugs like speed or meth. Tex Watson and Susan Atkins were the biggest abusers. They had a secret stash of speed that they kept hidden away from Manson, who didn't like the harder stuff. They didn't want him to know they were taking it, but they would sneak away together and take it for certain times and days when they needed more of an edge. The Creepy Crawlies also started at this time. Now, the Creepy Crawlies initially started off as a game, I think. Manson and a couple of people would go into houses in the richer part of town, and they wouldn't take anything, they wouldn't hurt anybody, but they would just kind of move their furniture around. They just wanted to mess with people. They would sneak in and out without a sound, and when the occupants of the houses awoke, they would find that their house had been broken into, but nothing had been taken, and it would kind of unsettle them a little bit. And that's what Charlie wanted. He wanted them to know, you're not untouchable, we can still get to you. It made the family feel powerful and above the law. And 2 months after Terry Melcher was originally supposed to come to Spawn Ranch and hear Charlie play music and sing, he did finally show up on May 18th. And once again, the family was sent running in circles to prepare for his arrival. The girls baked cookies and muffins, and Charlie put on his deerskin suit. Charlie made the girls rehearse with him tirelessly in the weeks leading up to this. All night and all day, just singing backup for him.
No worries, Michael. Appreciate you being
how
here.
they should strip their clothes off suggestively to the music. But when Melcher arrived, he wasn't interested in baked goods or talking to Charlie about his philosophies or even messing around with any of the girls. He was all business at this point. He came for one thing, and he was going to listen to Manson, and then he was going to go. After the performance, Melcher wasn't really interested in anything that Charlie had to offer, but he did give Charlie $50. Melcher felt bad for the people in the ranch. He knew that a big part of what they did was go through dumpsters and things to get food. And he noticed that there was a lot of children running around. So he thought if the $50 could help these people in some way, then it was something he was willing to give. But he was not willing to give Manson a recording contract. He didn't think that Manson had anything that anybody else who was trying to get famous at that point in time didn't have. When he was gone, the family gathered around Charlie to see what had happened. Was he going to sign you? When do you start? And even though Manson knew it was pretty much over, it wasn't going to happen, he couldn't have anybody thinking that or knowing that. He had to keep their faith in him. And Charlie Manson wasn't somebody who got rejected, so he showed them the $50, and he was like, listen, he wanted me to sign a contract right now, but I don't do contracts, that's like a societal thing. So he gave me this $50, and I gave him my word, and everybody knows I'm a man of my word. So they were all impressed, they were like, whoa, he's gonna make it. This is gonna happen for us. Charlie's plan was that if now anything went wrong, or when they all discovered that he wasn't actually going to get signed, he would make it look as if Melcher had welched on the deal, as if he'd backed out.
Melcher the Welcher.
And that's exactly what happened. Terry wasn't interested in signing Charlie, but he knew of a smaller producer who would drive around in a van and kind of record people on reservations and communes, and he thought maybe that guy would want to hear what Charlie had. Maybe those two could hook up and, he'd be out of Melcher's hair. So he brought this guy to the ranch on June 6th, 1969. But while the producer was there, someone slipped him a good amount of LSD, and he tripped so badly, he had to be taken home immediately. So while Terry and this guy and Manson were walking out to Terry's car so Terry could get the guy home, Manson's still following behind, talking about himself, talking about all the things they can do together, when Randy Starr ran up and started waving a gun at them. Now, Randy Starr is another funny little piece of this Charlie Manson puzzle. Randy was a Hollywood stuntman who was working as a ranch hand at Spawn when Manson and the family settled there. When he ran up to Manson and Terry, he was drunk and he was just kind of messing around with the gun. But Manson freaked out and he said, "Don't you draw on me." And then he beat the crap out of this guy, like within an inch of his life. And Randy Starr was like twice his size. But Manson took him down. And Terry, seeing all this happen, he was kind of like, I don't know whether to be grateful that Manson maybe saved my life or to be disgusted that he just beat this guy within an inch of his life while I'm standing here. Terry drove away from Spawn Ranch that day knowing that it was the last time he was going to be there. Whether he was scared or grateful or admired Charlie or thought maybe he had something special, he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. Manson knew that too, so he told the family that Terry had betrayed him and turned his back on him. And he wanted to keep Manson's music from the public. That was the whole goal. That was what Helter Skelter was all about. It was happening. When people wanted to keep something that was good for the world away from the world, it showed you that the world was coming to an end. But now Charlie was off the rails, and most of his family was right there with him. The creepy crawlies at night turned into robberies, with mostly credit cards and money being taken. And when Manson finally figured out where Terry Melcher lived in Malibu, they went to Melcher's house and they stole a telescope off his porch. In their eyes, they were sending him a message: no matter where you go, we'll find you, we can see you. Terry Melcher, once he had left Spawn Ranch, he didn't give Manson and his crew another thought. He was on to bigger and better things. They weren't even on his radar, so he just saw the telescope was gone and was like, oh, somebody stole my telescope. He didn't make the connection between Manson and the missing telescope at all. So while the family's all like, haha, we really stuck it to Terry, he's going to be so scared when he sees that telescope is missing, Terry Melcher didn't really feel anything about it at all. He definitely didn't take it as a message from Charles Manson. But that's how ingrained in their own little world they were. They thought that they were so important so essential to everybody's lives that they entered. It's a very delusional, paranoid way of thinking. It's like when you look at Facebook and somebody writes something like, oh, if I cut you off, it's because you handed me the scissors. One of those stupid generic pictures where they post it, but they don't give any explanation because then they want you to be like, oh my God, what happened? Who did this to you? Well, when you look at that picture and you think like, oh my God, they're talking about me. That's how Manson's family was. They're the person that literally would look on Facebook or Twitter and find all of these obscure comments from people that they know and think that they're talking about them. In his daily and nightly sermons, he now started wondering aloud, maybe they should amp the creepy crawlies up a little bit. Maybe they should start kidnapping people or tying them up and scaring them. He asked his family, would you die for me? And some of them agreed without a doubt. Some of them were not so on board with that idea. Pat Krenwinkel, she tried to escape. She left with a member of the Straight Satans. But within a couple of days, Charlie tracked her down and he made her come back with him. She thought it was because he was magical. So this reinforced in her head that he was an otherworldly being.
She tracked her down.
No matter
He was
where she
magical.
went, he would find her. So why bother leaving? Really, it was just that Manson had a lot of contacts in the city and a lot of connections, and he was able to find out who had seen this guy and Pat together and then track them down. When Leslie Van Houten expressed her concerns about things kind of getting violent and weird, Charlie drove her to the top of a hill and they got out and he told her, hey, if you really want to leave me, you can go ahead and jump. And so at this point, they were kind of going back and forth between Spawn and Barker Ranch, just trying to get everything prepared, hiding food on the way. When they were at Barker Ranch, they were kind of going out every once in a while. He was sending people out to look for this bottomless pit in the desert. And previously, they had all gone out to Barker Ranch and then left, but they left 2 people behind to kind of keep an eye on things and make sure that no one else came in and tried to settle in that area. But the 2 people that they left behind, Brooks Poston and a girl named Juanita, they had pretty much defected at this point. Brooks and Juanita had been at Barker Ranch since February, and when the rest of the family left them there, they said they'd be back within 10 days, but they never did come back. They were there alone when a man named Paul Crockett and his partner stopped by. This was around March 11th, and Crockett could tell that Juanita and Brooks were under some kind of mind control. They were unable to invite him in, but they were also unable to send him away. They didn't know what to do since they hadn't been given specific orders on what to do in this specific situation, so they pretty much just didn't do anything. Paul and his partner were gold prospectors, but Paul had also studied with one of the 5 founding members of the Church of Scientology in his early days, so he knew a little something about what it looked like when someone was in a
one of the
cult,
5 founding
when they were
members?
under
Yeah,
somebody
so
else's control.
hang around with Aleister Crowley.
Reprogram them from that control. Paul taught Brooks and Juanita that the way that Charlie had control over them was through agreements. The agreement that Charlie was something special, that Charlie was powerful. The agreement that served Charlie's purposes, but nobody else's. Paul Crockett said that these implied agreements were very powerful, and that was what was making it difficult to break away from Charlie. Over the course of 8 months during the spring and summer of 1969, he worked with them. They would go over to where he had settled and hang out with him, and he told them that their egos had been stripped from them completely. This was why they were unable at this point to think independently. When they would visit him, he began the task of deprogramming them, and he used basically physical labor and stuff at first so that they would be distracted. And then he started kind of ordering them to do things. So he would say, follow me.
I'm swapping
because
out
that was what
my
they were
tubes
familiar
right
with.
now. I
After
think
they
we're
began
good
to
on
trust
the
him and
propane
follow
tube
him,
now.
he then started
We are
to
going
ask
to
them
test
questions. Ask them to make plans for the future.
Left this
So
open.
what do you want to do tomorrow? What are your plans for next week? This way they could think past the commands and begin using goal-setting methods. Juanita and Brooks said they were worried to even be visiting him because they knew that Charlie had magical powers, but Crockett told them that he had magical powers too. When he was 15, he'd been thrown from a car, and he had managed
No more
to
propane
basically
leak.
create a force field around himself so that when he landed, he would be unharmed. When he was in the war and flying a B-24, he'd been under enemy attack and some shrapnel had come through the plane, but he had managed to slow down time so that he could avoid being hit.
My ankle!
He told me that he'd created a magical boundary around his area, and that Manson could not enter it without getting permission to do so. Later, when the rest of the family finally did arrive at Barker Ranch, Manson figured out what happened, and he sent a couple of people over to Crockett's to try to get Poston and Juanita to come back. Paul Watkins, one of his most devout followers since the beginning, and Barbara, the one who had made the belladonna tea, they went over there and basically told Juanita and Poston, like, Manson wants you to come back. Now, Barbara had always been a member of the family who had pushed back against Manson, and Juanita remembered one day that Barbara had been stoned for questioning him, and as this was happening, the rest of the family sat around chanting and watching it happen. Barbara looked at them and said, "You're all evil, and this is hell." And Charlie told her, "Of course this is hell. Remember, everything your mommy told you was wrong. Where you want to be is hell, and we're all devils." Manson spent a lot of time working on Barbara specifically, trying to break her. And Juanita remembers that when Paul and Barbara came to try to get them to come back, Barbara seemed very interested in how they'd been able to break Manson's spell. Even after Brooks, Poston, and Juanita said they weren't going to go back, Paul Watkins and Barbara stayed for days, allegedly trying to convince them to come back. But it seemed like they were just trying to figure out how they managed to get away. Eventually, Paul said they needed to get back to Manson, but they weren't looking forward to letting Manson know.
Wait, was that the problem this entire time? There's no way.
Before they left, Juanita and Brooks Poston asked Paul to do something very specific when telling Manson about their desertion. In front of the whole family, Paul had asked Manson to release Poston and Juanita from their agreements, and they would in turn release Manson from any agreements they made with him. Since Charlie always made a big deal about nobody being better than anybody else, he'd be unable to refuse this request when faced
I guess it was the
with
propane line that was messed up, not the oxygen.
Charlie responded, "Of course they're released. No one has any agreements with me, with us." Watkins then asked
Going
him,
well, we're working on
me from my
our lines right now.
And Manson replied, "Of course." And then Barbara piped up, "And me?" And Manson said, "Yeah." And then Paul Watkins motioned to the rest of the people sitting around and said, "What about them?" And then Charlie got agitated, and he was like, "Enough with this shit about agreements." And he wouldn't release anybody else. Paul Watkins returned to Crockett, Juanita, and Poston in June. He'd finally broken the spell that Manson had put on him. Paul Watkins would still visit the ranch. He had a relationship with one of the girls there. He'd go there and, smoke weed and play music with them. But whenever Manson started talking about Helter Skelter and asked him to participate in any of those activities, Paul answered with firm no. And the whole Helter Skelter preparations had been amped up at this time. Everybody was getting amped up. They kept asking Manson, "When's this going to happen? When's this going to happen?" Now, I believe that Manson never really thought that Helter Skelter was going to happen. He didn't believe in it. And by his own words, it was something he didn't believe in. It was just kind of a distraction for people. When people kept asking him and they were getting kind of restless, he had to do and say something to calm them and give them what they wanted. So he started to wonder how
30 minutes left in that
the blacks
stream.
were too stupid to get Helter Skelter.
So we got about 45 minutes left in our
Now, they
stream.
had been raided back in April because the police had discovered they'd been stealing cars and then turning them into dune buggies, and a lot of these dune buggies had been taken. Without the proper vehicles hiding out in the desert, it wasn't going to last
as well.
So he and Tex came up with a plan. Another stupid plan in a series of stupid plans that Manson and Tex Watson would formulate together. The girl that Tex had been dating before, Luella, she was still dealing drugs. And on July 1st, Tex called her and he told her he had a bunch of drugs that he needed to get rid of and sell, and did she have a buyer for them? She told him she did know someone who would give them some money up front and then the rest of the money upon delivery of the 25 kilos of marijuana. Tex met with the buyer, a big, scary drug dealer from LA named Bernard Crow, but everybody called him Lots of Papa. Lots of Papa gave him the $2,500 up front, but he wasn't stupid. He wasn't born yesterday. This was his gig. He knew all about the drug dealing world. And he wasn't going to let Tex walk away with the money, just giving a promise that he would deliver the drugs. So Lots of Papa said that he was going to hold on to Luella until Tex got back. But there were no drugs. They didn't have any drugs. So Tex brought the money back to Charlie. He claims, by his own admission, he didn't care what happened to Luella. He just knew Charlie needed the money. That was his goal, that was his mission, and he'd achieved it. When he got back, he told Manson what had happened, and that Lots of Papa may be calling and looking for him. So Charlie should say that Tex had deserted Spawn Ranch weeks before. Within no time, Lots of Papa was calling the ranch and asking
I
where
just wanted
Tex
to
was.
fix the
and Charlie
this tube and figured
stayed
might
to
as
plan
well
and
hang
said
out
he
for
hadn't
the
been there
rest
in
of the
weeks.
time as well.
But Lots of
And I am going to swap this one out eventually as well. That'll be nice. Not have to fucking worry
Want to
about
see what a
that.
Divio can mean for your condition? Ask your doctor for more information.
Ask your doctor for more information.
Papa did not believe him, so he told Charlie, hey, you either give me my money or my drugs back, or me and my guys are going to be at your ranch in a matter of days, and we're going to just destroy it and kill everybody there. Manson thought it would be a good idea. He cut Lots of Papa off at the pass. So he grabbed another member, Thomas Wallerman, otherwise known as TJ, gave him a gun and said, listen, we're going to go find this drug dealer, and then you're going to kill him. I'm not going to pull the trigger. You're going to pull the trigger. You're going to kill this dude. Okay? Let's go. When the time came and they were faced with Lots of Papa and it was time to pull the trigger, TJ couldn't do it though. So Manson thought, if you need something done, do it yourself. And he grabbed the gun from TJ and shot Lots of Papa in the chest. Before they left, Manson grabbed a leather jacket from the scene of the crime and took to wearing it quite often. The next day, a story that a Black Panther had been found dead was on the news, and Charlie panicked. Bernard Curl was black, and he had killed him yesterday, so that meant he'd killed a Black Panther. However, Bernard Curl wasn't in the Black Panthers, and he wasn't dead either. Manson thought he had killed him, but he hadn't. Once again, it shows you the way that Manson's mind worked, and how
It's on the news. It's about
was
me.
the only one that existed. I shot a black guy yesterday. Today a black guy on the news is found dead. Must be the same black guy.
Yep.
There's no other black guys in LA. That's the one I killed.
Same black
Charlie
guy.
had no idea that Lots of Papa survived the attack until he testified against him at trial later.
That's
Afterwards,
hilarious.
Manson was furious
You
with
should be
TJ
dead.
for not having the guts to actually do what needed to be done, and TJ ran away. He'd seen that Manson was willing to kill and capable of doing so, and he didn't want the next bout of rage to be turned on him. Manson told everybody at the ranch that he'd killed a Black Panther, and they needed to be on high alert now because it was more than likely at this point that his comrades would be at the ranch very soon to avenge their fallen brother's death. In July, another member joined the family. Linda Kasabian was from a working-class family from New England. Her parents struggled with money and relationship issues, and eventually her father left, abandoning his wife and daughter. Her mother remarried, but her new husband and her daughter did not get along. She was described as starry-eyed and romantic, shy, intelligent, but forced to grow up too quickly. When she was 16, she left home and went west in search of God. She got married and divorced, drifted to Florida where her father had moved to try and reconnect with him unsuccessfully, and then moved to Boston where she met and married Robert Kasabian. The two had a daughter they named Tanya, but the relationship went south very quickly, and Linda and her baby went back to New Hampshire to live with her mother. Later, Robert
That's
contacted
definitely the
Linda and
problem.
told her he wanted to reunite.
The
And when
pressure
she
is
come
too
to
high
LA,
for
he and his friend were
this.
planning a sailing trip
But
to South America.
because,
They lived together in the Topanga Canyon
shitty
area for a
tube.
while, and Linda became pregnant again. But then her husband left her to go on the sailing trip, and she was feeling aimless and betrayed when she met Gypsy. Gypsy told her about this utopia that she lived in, where everybody was happy and loved each other. They were all searching together for an underground city where they would wait out the violence and turmoil that was coming. On July 4th, Linda and her baby daughter joined Gypsy and went back to Spawn Ranch. Upon her arrival, Tanya was taken from her and put with the other children to be raised by somebody else. And that same night she met and had sexual relations with Tex Watson. Shortly thereafter, she was introduced to Charlie, who she was very impressed with. She thought he looked godlike in his deerskin outfit. And after she had sex with him, he talked to her about why he thought that she had come to be with them. He'd always been very good at sniffing out people's weaknesses, their Achilles heel. He basically told her, you're here because you have daddy issues. And she was like, well, I do have daddy issues. I hate my stepfather, and my father abandoned me, and when I tried to reconnect with him, that didn't work. I do have daddy issues. This guy's brilliant. The most valuable thing about Linda to Charlie, however, was the fact that she had a valid driver's license, the only person at this time who had a valid driver's license. In July, Manson went looking for Dennis Wilson. He was out of money again. The $2,500 they'd gotten from the botched drug deal with Lots of Papa had run out very quickly, and Dennis Wilson had always been so generous in the past.
Oh yeah, I
He
didn't turn the
was
oxygen
perfect.
back on
And
yet.
didn't he owe Charlie for that song that he'd stolen from him? Now, allegedly, when Charlie and Dennis finally did meet up, Charlie took a bullet out and showed it to Dennis Wilson. And when Dennis said, what's that? Charlie said, it's a bullet. And every time you look at it, I want you to think about how nice it is that your children are still safe. According to reports, Dennis Wilson didn't take that very well. He took it as a threat. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, no shit.
He proceeded to grab Manson by the head, throw him down on the ground, and give him a thorough beating in front of everybody who was there. Needless to say, Dennis Wilson was no longer going to be a source of income for Manson, so he needed to find another way to get money, and fast. Enter Gary Hinman, the music teacher slash mescaline grower from Topanga Canyon. The guy they had actually spent a lot of time with, who had been gracious and generous enough to let them stay in his house and let them drive his cars. Charlie thought because of where he lived and the job he had that he was pretty wealthy and had a lot of money. There was also another reason that he was interested in meeting back up with Gary Hinman. Bobby Beausoleil had bought a lot of mescaline off of Gary Hinman, and he had sold it to the Straight Satans. But according to the Straight Satans, they had had a pretty bad experience with it, and they thought that the mescaline had been a bad batch. So they told Bobby that they needed their money back. Bobby went to Hinman's home with Mary Bruner and Susan Atkins, and he told Gary, "You sold me some bad drugs and I need the money back." And Gary Hinman was like, "There must be some mistake. Those drugs weren't bad, and even if they were, I already spent that $1,000 that you gave me." Bobby didn't believe him, so Gary actually had to pull out his checkbook and show him how the money had gone in and how it had gone out. Bobby had Susan Atkins hold Gary at gunpoint while he rummaged around his house trying to find something that would be worth the $1,000. As he was looking around the house, Gary Hinman lunged at Susan to try to get the gun from her. And as they were struggling for the gun, Susan called for Bobby's help. So Bobby ran in. It's the three of them wrestling for this gun, trying to get possession of it. And as they were doing that, the gun went off. It didn't hit anybody, but it kind of stunned everyone. And it allowed Bobby to get the gun back in his possession. Gary Hinman begged for them to leave and not hurt him. He even signed over both his cars to them so that they would go. But when Bobby called Manson at the ranch and let him know that he didn't have any money for him, Manson was like, "I'm gonna handle this." And he grabbed his samurai sword and Bruce Davis, and they drove over to Hinman's house. As soon as they got there, Manson proceeded to take the samurai sword and basically almost entirely slashed off Gary Hinman's left ear. And then he and Bruce Davis left. Bruce took the car that they'd come in, and Manson took one of Gary Hinman's cars. Now at this point, Gary Hinman's freaking out, right? He's just had his ears slashed off with a samurai sword. And the girls kind of had a soft spot for him. I'm pretty sure both of them had slept with him at one time or multiple times. And he was begging to get medical attention. "Will you bring me to the hospital? Please, like my ear's going to fall off." So Susan and Mary ended up taking some dental floss and stitching his ear back on, or trying to. I'm sure it was not a very accurate job. Gary Hinman's pretty pissed off now. He's given them his cars.
Whatever.
He doesn't really have anything to give them. And now
hopefully
his ears will stop on with the dental floss, so he tells them he's going to go to the police. And as soon as he says that, Bobby allegedly
back on
called Manson
TikTok
at the
on the
ranch,
19th.
and allegedly Manson told him, "You know what to do." If Hinman had to die anyways, because he was going to turn them in if they let him live, they might as well use this opportunity to kickstart Helter Skelter. Bobby stabbed Hinman in the chest twice, and he and the two girls took turns holding a pillow over Gary's face until he was dead. After that, Bobby Beausoleil took Hinman's blood and made this sort of crude paw print on the wall to represent the Black Panthers, and then next to the paw print on the wall, he wrote "Political Piggy" in Hinman's blood. The three of them walked around the house trying to wipe away fingerprints or, remove any trace of evidence that they'd been there, and afterwards they got into Hinman's other car and they drove back to Spawn Ranch. When everybody was back at the ranch, they waited for the news to break. But after a couple of days, they hadn't heard anything. Bobby returned to the scene, concerned that the paw print that he'd made in blood with his own hand would somehow lead the police to him. So he tried to scrub it off, but it was already dried on and they wouldn't budge. And although Charlie wanted the murder of Hinman kept quiet, Susan and Bobby couldn't help but brag about it. That was in Susan's personality. She wanted everybody to know that she was kind of in charge and she had what it took to do what was needed to be done. And Bobby, he didn't like the fact that after Manson had killed lots of Papa, he bragged about it to everybody, but now he wanted Bobby to be quiet about his contribution to the cause.
20 minutes
Susan
left
gossiped with the other girls
Yeah, we'll end
about
at
the
3
noises
instead of
that Gary Hinman had made as he was dying.
I swear I
and
still
this
smell
disgusted quite a few of them. Ella Jo Bailey and a male member of the family that she had been dating decided to leave, and they asked Pat Krenwinkel to come with them because Pat and Ella were friends. But Pat remembered how the last time she left, Manson had found her very quickly, and she knew, or she thought she knew, that no matter where they went, they would be found. So she didn't feel like there was any point in trying to escape. The police discovered Hinman's body on July 31st when a couple of his friends stopped by at his house to visit, and they were concerned when he didn't answer the door. Police went through the scene and collected evidence, including a very nice and whole thumbprint in blood. And they also made note that both of Hinman's cars were
Might
gone.
just be lingering.
Now, Charlie
from...
had his Volkswagen, and he'd already gotten rid of that. But Bobby was still driving around in his Fiat. And he had stashed the bloody murder weapon in the wheel well.
Might just be lingering
now,
from
Charlie
earlier.
at this point was getting kind of anxious. You've got what he thought was the murder of Lott's papa and the murder of Gary Hinman. And he kind of feels like any day now, the authorities are going to descend on Spawn Ranch or Barker Ranch and take all of them to prison. So he wanted to leave for a couple of days to clear his
it was
head.
just lingering.
On August 3rd, he drove north. And this was when he picked up what would become his last girlfriend, a 17-year-old named Stephanie Schramm. She was on a trip back from Reno with a friend of hers, and they'd stopped at a gas station so she could use the bathroom. Charlie had spent the night smoking weed in his car by the ocean, and around 2 a.m., he ventured into that same gas station when he saw a pretty girl going into the bathroom. He waited for her to come out, and when she did come out, he approached her with the best pickup line ever. "What's a pretty girl like you doing out so late?" It literally only took a couple of minutes, and Stephanie was under his spell. She told her friend she wasn't going to be continuing on. She was going to be going with Charlie. Okay, sorry for the outfit change. This is a different day. I had to pick Aiden up from school sick, so I had to stop recording. So we're going to resume here. When Manson got back to Spawn Ranch with his new girlfriend, Stephanie, she was in for a shock like so many before her who thought that they were Manson's one and only. She discovered that there was many more girls living with her boyfriend that she would now have to compete for. And he appeased her by telling her that, yeah, everything was kind of crazy right now, but in a couple of weeks he would be exclusively hers. When Manson got back, he was feeling kind of relaxed and good after a couple of days away. He'd had some fun, he'd seen the ocean, he met a new girl, but everybody at Spawn Ranch was super stressed out, and there was a tension in the air. And the reason for that was because Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested. On August 6th, 2 highway patrolmen spotted a broken down Fiat on a highway near St. Louis Obispo, and they ran the plates and saw that there was an APB out on it in relation to a murder. So they walk up to the car and they see Bobby Beausoleil curled up inside, sleeping. They wake him up and they ask him what's going on with his car, and at first he lied, and he said that he had just bought it from a black guy a couple of days ago. He was trying to keep up the whole helter-skelter thing, but they weren't buying that, so they promptly arrested him, and they impounded the car, and it wasn't long before they found the bloody knife in the wheel well of the Fiat. On top of that, they had the thumbprint that they'd found at the murder scene at Hinman's house, and it matched Bobby. So he pivoted, he changed his story, and he said that he and a couple of friends had gone to Gary's house, and they found him already attacked. So they tried to provide him some medical aid, and because of that, he was so grateful that he signed over his cars to them. Then they left, and after that, he must have died. Well, even though this was a very believable story, the police did not believe it, and they charged him with the murder of Gary Hinman. Bobby had used his one phone call to call Charlie at the ranch, but Charlie was still on his finding yourself mission. He was off taking drugs, picking up girls in gas station bathrooms. So Bobby talked to Linda Kasabian, and he basically said, listen, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to talk, but if Charlie could help, that would really be great. 2 days later, Friday, August 8th, a handyman was at the Polanski residence, and he was painting the room that would become the nursery for Sharon and Roman's child. And he removed the screens out of the windows in these rooms so that they wouldn't get paint on them, and then he left the windows open and left the house around 1:30 p.m. so that the room could dry. 2 trunks had also been delivered to the home that day that belonged to Roman in preparation for his arrival, and he had talked to his wife Sharon on the phone earlier that day and promised that he would be home in time for his birthday on August 18th. Sharon Tate had lunch with some friends, and she also received a call from Jay Sebring, who told her he would be by to visit her that evening. Rudy Altobelli, who was still out of town, had arranged for a temporary groundskeeper to be staying in the guest cottage while he was gone, and this man's name was William Garrettson. Earlier that day, the gardener had told William to make sure that he watered the gardens and the grounds that weekend because it was supposed to be very hot. At that point, William wasn't feeling very well, so he was just in the guest cottage, basically sleeping it off. When Charlie returned home and heard about Bobby's arrest, he knew he had to do something to at least try and get him out, or it would only be a matter of time before he cracked. He contemplated just leaving, which is usually what he did when the heat started to get on him. But his followers told him they would do anything to keep their Messiah with them, and they started brainstorming what they could do to get Bobby out. Some of the family members recalled a movie they'd seen recently about a murderer that had gotten released from prison because of a string of copycat murders. So maybe they could commit more murders that looked like Hinman's murder. That way the police thought they had the wrong guy behind bars and they would let Bobby go. They honestly had no idea how the law works. None of these people had a clue about how the law works. This would also hopefully serve the dual purpose of getting Helter Skelter kickstarted, because the things they left behind at the scene of Hinman's murder, the paw prints and the words, they hadn't really been publicized or looked into as anything, so it hadn't achieved the result they wanted. Mary Bruner and Lynette Squeaky Fromm were given some stolen credit cards to go to Sears and purchase some things for the family. Now, Charlie claims that he forgot these credit cards were stolen.
Yep.
That's his story. Which
My bad.
It kind of begs the question, did you think that you had credit cards? Did you remember going to the bank and applying for a credit card?
those cards.
But anyways, they went to Sears with the stolen credit cards and they were arrested for trying to use stolen credit cards. With Mary, Squeaky, and Bobby all behind bars, Charlie really started to freak out because at any time now, any one of them could turn on them. So the night of August 8th, 1969, Charlie and Tex Watson began to prepare for the events of that evening. According to Tex Watson, he had already been tripping on LSD that day, so he didn't even know what was going on. And Charlie picked 3 girls to go with him: Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Basically brand new to this group, been there for a month, but she had a valid driver's license, and he wanted to make sure that on their way to commit a crime, they didn't get pulled over for the crime of driving without a valid driver's license. According to Manson himself, he told Tex to go to a place like where Terry Melcher.
Morningstar Farms veggie sausage.
Mistress Night.
Odor is hard done. Eliminating it is easy with OxyClean Odor Blasters.
Melcher lived. He claims he didn't explicitly tell Tex to go to Cielo Drive and kill Sharon Tate. And although this series of events that would follow is often painted as a revenge story, Charlie Manson being mad at Terry Melcher for his rejection, so he sent people to his house to kill him, not knowing he didn't live there anymore. That's not true. We know that Manson knew Melcher didn't live at Cielo Drive anymore. He'd gone there and been told he didn't live there. And then afterwards, they found his new house in Malibu and stole his telescope off his porch. So Manson was very aware that Terry Melcher did not live at this house. Now, Vincent Bugliosi in his book Helter Skelter would have you believe that Manson did say explicitly to Tex, go to this house. I don't believe that's true. There's no motive for Tex to go specifically to that house. Charlie wanted him to go to a house like that. He didn't really care what house it was. Tex just happened to choose that house, most likely because he was so high he didn't know which way was up, and that was the easiest address for him to remember because he'd been there once before with Manson and Dennis Wilson when Dennis had dropped Terry Melcher off home. They made sure to bring their knives, some rope, and wear dark clothes. And they also had a change of clothes that they would wear after the deed was done. Pat Krenwinkel couldn't find her knife, but she didn't want to tell anybody and have them wait for her. And Manson gave Tex a .22 caliber high-standard blunt-line revolver that he had used to shoot lots of pop-up. Now, he did explicitly tell Tex, don't use this gun unless you absolutely have to, because obviously the gun's going to make noise. Always use your knives, if at all possible. This gun was the same one that stuntman Randy Starr had pulled on Manson the day that
it's a pumpkin and we have candles on it.
Looked back. It had allegedly been one of the weapons that was stolen from the archery headquarters in El Monte, California on the night of March 12, 1969. Randy Starr claimed he had obtained the gun in a trade with a man named Ron. And remember that because we will come back to it later. Before
My
they
fingers smell like
Tex and
propane,
Susan
that's
dipped
part of
into
it
their
too.
hidden stash of meth, and as they all piled into the car, Charlie allegedly told the girls to do everything that Tex told them to, and to leave a sign that they'd been there, something witchy. Once again, allegedly. At this point, Tex Watson is the only one who knows what their mission is. The girls have no idea. They don't know, maybe they're in for another creepy crawly. They don't know what's going on. But they were told to bring their knives. And everybody had been talking about copycat murders in the days leading up to them going on this mission. So I have a hard time believing that these were just little naive girls who thought they were out for an innocent evening of home invasions. When they pulled up to the security gate of 10050 Cielo Drive, Tex got out and told the girls to stay in the car. He then took bolt cutters and he killed the power to the main house and the guest cottage. He then took the gun and some nylon rope and he motioned for the girls to exit the car and follow him. At that point, he told them, "We're gonna go inside here and we're gonna murder everyone in there." They didn't act shocked. They didn't say no. They didn't run away and try to get help. They didn't run away to just escape. According to Pat Krenwinkel, they were little kitty cats. They were mentally gone, and they'd been told to do everything that Tex told them to do, so they obeyed. That evening, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frokowski had been out to dinner
like
together
this for a
at
sec,
Al
but it's the piece on the table that just made that
called
sound.
the restaurant earlier that day and made an 8 o'clock dinner reservation
I
for
was like,
him
yo, what
and
the
the
fuck?
3 others. After waiting about 15 minutes in the bar, the 4 of them were seated and unknowingly ate their last meals. They left around 9:45 p.m. and headed back to Cielo Drive. That same night, part-time caretaker William Garrettson had hitched a ride up to Sunset Boulevard to get cigarettes and food, and he hitchhiked back. When he got there, it was a little bit after 10 p.m. He saw Jay Sebring's Porsche parked in the driveway, Sharon Tate's Camaro was also
this
there,
cut
and
tubing,
the Firebird,
the inside of it,
drove. He
smells like
went into the
propane,
guest couch
obviously.
and
Damn,
ate
I'm
his
dumb.
dinner alone. But later that evening, he got an unexpected guest. Stephen Parent, 6-foot-tall, red-headed college student who was working 2 jobs to afford his education, and he had given Garrettson a ride a few weeks prior to this night. He was trying to sell a clock radio he had for a few extra bucks. Steve Parent was pretty much a genius when it came to electronics. One of his part-time jobs was at an electronics store, and his sister said that he would often bring home clock radios and other electronics and pull them apart so he could see how they
This
worked.
piece isn't good
He had
anymore,
remembered
but this
Garrettson
tubing
and
is still
given
good.
him a ride back to Cielo Drive, so he
Actually,
thought
unplug
maybe
the computer.
Garrettson owned that home and he had money.
Good night,
Maybe
Jay.
he'd be interested in this clock
We won't be
radio
on
he
too much
had to
longer,
sell.
just
He arrived
another,
at the guest cottage around 11:45 p.m. that evening, and he plugged the clock radio in to show Garrettson how it worked. Garrettson wasn't interested in the clock radio, but he did offer Steve Parent a drink. They had a beer together, they chatted. Steve Parent made a call to a friend from the cottage to meet up, and he unplugged the clock radio around 12:15 a.m. Garrettson walked Steve Parent back to his Wrangler that was parked in the driveway, and as they walked, they heard Rudy Altobelli's dogs barking, which usually signified there was somebody walking around on the property. But Garrettson wasn't alarmed by this because he had seen that Sharon Tate had guests, so there were people walking around on the property. Steve Parent got into his car and drove up to the electronic gates. As he rolled down the window to press the button to open the gates, he heard a voice yell, "Halt." When Tex and the girls had been walking up the driveway to the house, they'd seen his headlights, so they jumped in the bushes to hide. But when he stopped at the gate to open it, Tex Watson emerged from the bushes, holding a gun in one hand and a knife in the other. According to Tex Watson, Steve Parent begged for his life. He said, "Please don't hurt me, I won't say anything." And he raised his arm defensively to block his face. And then, despite being given very specific instructions to not use the gun unless it was absolutely necessary, he shot the 18-year-old 4 times.
Good night, Arctic.
Why did Tex Watson emerge from hiding?
I'll take pictures of everything
shoot Steve
here
Parent, who was leaving,
and send them to you
hadn't
after
known
the
that they were
stream.
there? Was it because
Some
Manson had
detailed
told him
shots
to
of
kill
all the
everybody
good
on the property and he couldn't disobey orders? But Manson had also given him very direct orders to not use the gun unless absolutely necessary. A kid who's leaving the property, doesn't know you're there, and is going to be gone in 2 seconds doesn't seem like the kind of absolutely necessary,
Damn,
we need to
that tubing
protect
smells
ourselves
heavy.
situation.
I can smell it on my hands,
Or did
too.
Tex Watson kill
And it's not
Stephen
anything
Parent
here, I sprayed it
because
all.
Tex Watson is a killer? Tex Watson took the mission that Manson suggested to him because he wanted to, because he liked violence, because he wanted to kill people. Once Steve Parent was dead in the driver's seat, Tex reached in through the open window and shifted the car into neutral. Then he and the girls rolled it back up the driveway and left it parked there. The 4 of them made their way up to the main house where they could see Christmas lights twinkling on the fence. Lights that Candace Bergen had strung there when she lived at the house with Terry Melcher, and Sharon Tate thought they were pretty, so she left them up. Inside the main house, the gunshots had gone unnoticed, as they had gone unnoticed in the guest cottage where Garrettson was. The house is positioned in the canyon above Hollywood and Beverly Hills made sound a tricky thing. Any sound that happened on the grounds, you could probably hear it miles down the canyon. But something that happened right there on the property might be hard to hear even just 100 feet away. The sound of the gunshots didn't go completely unnoticed by everybody, though. Mr. and Mrs.
The propane line on the hand torch has a small leak as well. It's just old.
Drive heard
So I think
Mrs.
all of our
Knotts
problems
thought she
will
heard
get
what
fixed when we
sounded
get that
like
new one
3
in.
or 4 gunshots in quick succession coming from the direction of the driveway of 10050 Cielo Drive, Sharon Tate's residence. This was between 12:30 and 1 a.m., but when the couple heard nothing further, they decided to go back to sleep. Tim Ireland, a counselor who was supervising an overnight school camping trip, also heard some things. He was just about 3/4 of a mile south and downhill from the Polanski home, and he heard what sounded like a man screaming around 12:40 a.m. Inside the Cielo Drive home, Abigail Folger was in the guest bedroom. She was wearing a white nightgown and she was reading. Her boyfriend, Wojtek Frykowski, was asleep on the couch in the living room, and Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were in the master bedroom chatting on the bed. Because of her advanced pregnancy and the oppressive heat in LA at this time, they were on the tail end of a 3-day heat wave. Sharon was only wearing her underwear and a gauzy sort of nightgown draped over her shoulders. Both Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski were fully dressed. Now, because of the way Sharon was dressed, there were often rumors in the future, after the murders,
tiny leak to
that
it. I can
Sebring
smell
and
it.
Sharon Tate had been having an affair, that they rekindled their romance. There are no facts to back this up. However, after her death, an actor named Christopher Jones came forward and admitted to having an affair with Sharon Tate when she was about 6 weeks pregnant. Polanski himself has admitted to having multiple affairs while married to Sharon Tate, one of them being with Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Of course, we all know that Roman Polanski isn't a stand-up guy, facing 5 charges of statutory rape of underage girls from 1977 until today. He's even admitted to being attracted and drawn to younger girls in their teens. He says that all men are. They just don't say it or act on it. He's always tried to convince people that it's a natural thing, that what he's doing or what he's done, the way he feels, isn't abnormal at all. So basically, the man is and was a pedophile, and that's not really relevant to this story, but I wanted to bring it up because I know that if I talk about how much Roman loved his wife, because I do believe he loved her and cared about her, and I know he was devastated after her death. I talk about how much he loved his wife. There's always going to be the people in the comments who are like, well, he's a pedophile. Okay, I understand that he's a pedophile. I understand what has happened, but that is not this story. This is the story of Sharon Tate and what happened to her and her friends, and Roman plays a supporting character at best. I'm sure their marriage faced many problems and challenges, as often many marriages, if not all marriages, do. Basically, is it possible that Sharon Tate was having a relationship with Jay Sebring? Yes, but there's no evidence to support that theory. And I don't see why it would really matter. I don't see why people would judge Sharon Tate or Jay Sebring for that. The fact is, her husband was cheating on her often. She probably knew about it. Maybe they had that kind of marriage. Maybe they had that kind of relationship where they just agreed that they would see other people. Maybe they were swingers. We don't know what was going on, and we should not judge. And on that note, I'm going to end part 4 here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much for sticking with me. If you're still here after all of these parts, after all of this time, thank you so much.
Thank you as well for having cool information. You got cool stuff to say. We will be wrapping up our stream shortly as well. We'll go ahead and wrap it up now, actually, so I can cut off this propane. Throw this tubing outside for it to leak for a while. We will be back at the same time in the same place. I'll let everybody know if we monetize for sure. Y'all don't gotta worry about that. Y'all will be the first to hear when that happens. I do appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for being here. Lucinda, Arctic, Dishonored, Jay. Oh, Jay said bye earlier. Alrighty, friends. I will see y'all next time. Much love. Until then.